All right, so we'll go ahead and get started here. So, hello and welcome to the 2022 Spring Roadway Watercourse Crossing webinar series, presented by the Alberta Watercourse Crossing Collaborative. My name is Matthew Huberto, and I'll be your host for today. AWC3 is a non-for-profit organization whose primary objective is to restore lost and damaged fish habitat from poorly installed and maintained watercourse crossings. We achieve this objective through education and information transfer, from subject matter experts to practitioners. The webinar series was created to help achieve those objectives by discussing important topics in an easily accessible format. All these webinars are recorded and will be made available on AWC3's website. After each presentation today, there will be time for questions. We will also have an open question and answer period at the end of today's webinar. Questions can be asked by using the webinar toolbar located on the right side of your screen, which will allow you to type in questions. Our first speaker today is Danielle Allenbach and Rick Kirilluk from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada. Danielle is the Ontario Provincial Liaison and Partnership Coordinator on the partnerships team with DFO's Fish and Fish Habitat Protection Program. Danielle facilitates relationship building and cooperation with external partners in Ontario and across the region to support DFO's aquatic ecosystem priorities, and share information on DFO, their program, and applicable legislation to encourage and support good stewardship and increase compliance with external partners and stakeholders. In addition, she manages grants and contribution agreement programs for DFO's Ontario and Prairie region, enabling partners to restore and mitigate risks and impacts to the aquatic ecosystem and species at risk. Rick has been with Fisheries and Oceans Canada since 1990. He began his career at Canada's Centre for Inland Waters in Burlington, Ontario with the Science Branch, Great Lakes Laboratory for Fisheries and Aquatic Science, as a fisheries research biologist. In 1997, Rick joined the former Fish Habitat Management Program, now known as the Fish and Fish Habitat Protection Program, where over the last 24 years has held a variety of positions across the region. Rick is currently acting as the team leader, triage and planning out of Burlington, Ontario. All right, and without further ado, here's Rick and Danielle.
Apologies, I'm just trying to figure out the technology here. Can you confirm that you can see the presentation on your screen?
Yeah, we can see your presentation.
Okay, and it doesn't have notes or anything like that?
No notes.
Okay, perfect. And I'm trying to turn on my webcam here so that folks can see my face and who's talking to you, but I will probably turn it off for the presentation just to make sure we have no connection issues. So good morning, and wanted to thank Matthew for the introduction. And as he indicated, I'm joined here by Rick today, so I'll be walking through the presentation today, and Rick is going to help me answer some questions and be a panelist on the panel after all the presentations today. So thank you for having me. So, sorry, I'm just going to get set up here. So some of you might have been expecting my colleague Ray, who's been engaging with this group in the past. So unfortunately, Ray wasn't able to make it today, so I am stepping in his place. He asked me to cover a lot of information today, so I'm hoping to get through everything in about 20 minutes or so, and so that we will have some time for questions at the end. So I'll do my best to kind of talk fast and get through everything for you all. I did want to remind everyone that Ray did provide a presentation to this group in the fall of 2021, and that presentation provided a general overview of the Fisheries Act, Species at Risk Act, and DFO project review process. So I'm going to try not to repeat too many of the details from that presentation today, but I do understand, as Matthew indicated, that the presentation was recorded and it's on the AWC3 website if you want to have a look later. So my presentation today will provide an overview of the Fish and Fish Habitat Protection Program and how it's organized in our region. I'm going to remind you of relevant federal legislation and applicable prohibitions. I will share information on our Projects Near Water website and the key steps you'll want to take to determine if your project requires a review by DFO. And lastly, if you're required to submit a request for review to DFO, I'm going to cover some of the key pieces of information you should include about your project. So the Fish and Fish Habitat Protection Program works to ensure compliance with the Fish and Fish Habitat Protection components of the Fisheries Act and with the Species at Risk Act. The program reviews proposed works, undertakings, and activities that may impact fish and fish habitat. The first point of contact for the Fish and Fish Habitat Protection Program is our triage unit, who are the one window into DFO. So they receive and review all general inquiries, occurrences, and requests for reviews that you might be submitting for your projects. They'll work with other DFO units as necessary to address incoming requests and take the appropriate actions. One thing I want to highlight is that the projects submitted across Ontario and Prairie region are sent to our triage unit, which is located in Burlington. And it is the staff in Burlington that review all these projects for the region in its entirety. Our triage unit ensures regional decisions are consistent with national direction, and they are responsible for sending projects deemed likely to cause the death of fish or harmful alteration, disruption, or destruction of fish habitat, which is very wordy, so I'll refer to that as a HAD from here on out, to the appropriate regulatory review unit for a site-specific review of a project. So in order to streamline the process and provide proponents with a one-window approach, projects submitted into the Fish Habitat Protection Program's triage unit are coordinated with the Species at Risk program for possible impacts to species at risk and their critical habitat. So this aims to minimize duplication of work for both the proponent and DFO and ensures consistent advice across our programs. Proponents requiring approvals under either act would receive advice and/or approvals in one package. So when our triage unit deems that your project is likely to cause death of fish or a HAD, they refer your project to the appropriate regulatory review group. Our regulatory review team is organized by project sector type, and this slide provides an overview of those groups and their locations. So our mining, oil, and gas projects are sent to the Edmonton and Yellowknife offices. Linear projects are sent to Regina, hydroelectric and flows to Winnipeg, and coastal and marine to Burlington. Since this group is focused on culvert rehabilitation projects, those projects that are likely to cause death of fish and/or a HAD would most likely go to our linear team in Regina. So many of the watercourse crossing related requests, such as bridges, roads, stream crossings, and culverts, are reviewed by our linear team. One of the key takeaways from this slide and the previous slide is that our triage unit and regulatory review teams are not organized by geographic location. And why this is important to know is that our biologists who are reviewing your project details may not be familiar with your project's location. So it's very important that your request for review form contains enough information and details regarding your project at the forefront in order for our staff to properly assess your projects and avoid delays in the process. So this slide provides you with the contact information for Ontario and Prairie Region's triage unit. Since again, triage is the one window into DFO, all inquiries should be made to either the email or telephone number listed here on this slide. So this doesn't only include requests for reviews, but includes all general inquiries and reporting occurrences as well. When you do call the telephone number, you will get a voicemail, so make sure to leave a message, and we have staff monitoring the phone lines and messages during regular business hours. The next couple of slides focus on our legislation and applicable prohibitions. On this slide, we have language as written in the Fisheries Act for death of fish, which is subsection 3441 of the Act, and harmful alteration, disruption, or destruction of fish habitat, or AHAD, which is subsection 35.1 of the Act. The Fisheries Act is structured in a way that prohibits works, undertakings, or activities, and I'll refer to those as WUAs, from contravening these prohibitions that are listed here, unless they are carried out in accordance with exceptions listed in the Fisheries Act. DFO will apply a risk-based approach when evaluating the impacts of a WUA on fish and fish habitat. And what is not outlined on this slide, but important to know, and I think specifically for this group, is that there are a number of places in the Fisheries Act that relates to the protection of fish passage. And fish passage is normally assessed under Section 35 and is just as important as physical changes to fish habitat. So this slide outlines the prohibitions under the Species at Risk Act. To summarize the slide, because it's very wordy, a listing of a species triggers automatic prohibitions against killing, harming, harassing, capturing, or taking species at risk listed, possessing, collecting, buying, selling, or trading, and damaging or destroying the residence of an individual. This applies to any species that is listed as extirpated, endangered, or threatened under the Species at Risk Act. It is key to also point out that the Species at Risk Act prohibitions include protection to the individual themselves, their residence, and their critical habitat. So the last bullet on the slide here is Section 58, which prohibits the destruction of any part of the critical habitat identified in recovery strategy documents published in the Species at Risk Public Registry, and is officially protected through the establishment of a critical habitat order. Since the Species at Risk Act and Fisheries Act both work to protect fish and fish habitat, there is overlap between them, and both acts provide protection for fish and fish habitat. So this is why projects are reviewed by DFO under both pieces of legislation. This diagram shows when authorization is needed under both Species at Risk Act and the Fisheries Act, and when it may be needed under only one of these acts. And later on in the presentation, I go into a bit more detail on that as well. So now that you're aware of the main prohibitions under the two pieces of legislation, what do you do if you have a project that's in and around water? So we recommend the first step would be to check the project's near water website. A link to the website is provided at the bottom of the slide, and I've also provided a few other key pieces of information that, provide a few links to other pieces of information that might be helpful to you as well. So the website provides guidance on how to avoid impacts to fish and fish habitat and identifies a systematic process on how to determine when to submit a project into DFO for review. So you should remember that the Fisheries Act does not say you must come into DFO for a project review, but rather that you cannot cause the death of fish or AHAD to fish habitat. So ultimately, if you can incorporate relevant measures into your project to avoid harm, and you are certain there won't be any impacts to fish and fish habitat resulting from your project, there's no need to submit your project to DFO. The onus is on the proponent to review their project and to uphold the law. DFO has 6 codes of practices available for use on their website. If you can completely follow the codes of practice, in most cases, you would not need to come to DFO for a project review. There is an exception being the code of practice for temporary diversions and cofferdams, specifically if the reason for using those diversions can cause a AHAD. So all codes of practice do have restrictions on when or if they can be used in areas of species at risk or in critical habitat or residents of endangered or threatened species at risk. So this can impact many projects in Alberta because I understand so much of the province has species at risk or identified critical habitat. There's also a new regulatory review process map on our website that's quite good in helping identify the steps needed to determine if you need to come to DFO for a project review. So again, links to all that information is available from this slide. So in addition to the Projects Near Water website, you'll also want to consult the DFO Species at Risk mapping tool to determine if there are aquatic species at risk or critical habitat in your project area. The mapping tool provides an overview of the distribution of aquatic species at risk and the presence of their critical habitat within Canadian waters. If you can avoid impacts of your project, but it is occurring where there are species at risk or critical habitat, then you should submit your request for review to DFO. Remember that when we look at aquatic species at risk, we refer to those that are extirpated, threatened, or endangered. That being said, species of special concern still need to be considered, and we request that you use management plans when you design your project to address special concern species. So what projects need to be reviewed by DFO? In short, WUAs in and around water should be submitted to DFO for review under the Fisheries Act that are likely to result in the death of fish or a had of fish habitat. As well, DFO reviews WUAs that may affect aquatic species at risk, residences, and their critical habitat as per the Species at Risk Act. So I wanted to clarify how this specifically relates to the work that this group might undertake and provide examples of projects that could need DFO review. So to reiterate the previous slide, you'll need to come to DFO if you want to undertake a WUA that can result in the death of fish or a had. This could include impacts to fish passage, modifications or reduction of flow. So for example, if you're taking water, and it is important to remember that even impacts temporary in nature should also be considered. In addition, if your project could impact species at risk or critical habitat, you should also come to us for that as well. Examples of work could include, but aren't limited to, major crossing repairs, trail creation, new culvert installations, and culvert replacements. So the question you should ask yourself is, can impacts to fish and fish habitat be avoided by implementing measures to protect fish and fish habitat? And if you can follow the applicable measures to protect fish and fish habitat, and you can completely avoid impacts, you do not need to request a project review. Where impacts cannot be fully avoided, but you can mitigate, technically you should still come into DFO, but we recommend you list all your mitigation efforts on the request for review form for consideration. If you're ever uncertain if impacts can completely be avoided, we recommend you obtain guidance from a qualified professional, or if you're still uncertain, you can submit your project to us for review. So I've mentioned the request for review multiple times now. So the next few slides, I'll go over the request for review form, the process, and the information we're looking to see from proponents. So again, all forms are submitted to our triage unit through the general email address that was provided earlier in the presentation. When you submit your form, you will receive a confirmation email back to know that it's been received in our inbox. The link to the request for review form is provided on this slide. The same form is used for all types of projects, so from simple bank constructions to complex hydro projects. The form is 7 pages with instructions at the end. The instructions are very good, and I recommend you go through them when you're working through the form for your project. Some general guidance on the form. Incomplete requests will slow down the review of your project, so we recommend providing as much details at the forefront to help us with a thorough review and assessment of your project. So with that, complete all questions on the form unless they do not apply to your project. We do ask that you indicate not applicable if a question doesn't apply, so at minimum, we know that you've considered that question. If you have supplemental documentation, such as fisheries assessment reports, for example, it should be attached to the form. However, we still ask that the information is summarized directly in the form, and you indicate the section or page numbers applicable to that attachment to help us focus our review. We do not want to see attached or a cut and paste of the report information into the form, and you really should summarize that information. So treat the form as an executive summary and be sure to provide the key information that will help DFO to screen the project appropriately. Once you submit your form, DFO will then work with you to assess the risks to fish and fish habitat and provide guidance on how to comply with the Act. You may not require an authorization or a permit, but possibly additional mitigation measures or a redesign of the project might be necessary. So DFO will work with you to determine what the appropriate next steps are, and it is important not to submit an application for a permit or authorization until you are instructed to do so by DFO. We often do get asked questions around timelines for review. Timelines are influenced by a number of factors, including seasonal periods, staffing levels, and the diversity and quality of the information that's being submitted by proponents. So it is recommended you submit your project to DFO as far in advance as possible, and be sure to make sure that your requests for review forms are complete with as much information as necessary to help us with our assessment. And one last thing for this slide that I did want to highlight is that the request for review form can only be opened in Internet Explorer, and you can also try to download the form from your computer, save it, and work on it as a document. We are aware of the problem. We're trying to work through a solution, but sometimes it's challenging for proponents to open the form, so I wanted to clarify that. So given the restrictions on time, I am not able to go through the form in great detail, but in the next few slides, I walk through some of the key pieces of information we look for when completing our assessment of your project. That being said, Ray did share an example form specific to watercourse crossings in Alberta that I'm happy to share with the organizers of the event to share out to the group today. So for the request for review form, you'll want to include information such as the purpose and intent of the project. So for example, with this group, it could be the removal of an existing structure for the purposes of improving fish passage. Your approach to the project, including timing and duration, along with the project footprint. You should also include details on the construction method and types of material and equipment to be used. And you should identify and describe all temporary and permanent activities and their footprints. Where your project involves physical structures, plans and specifications should be provided for these. In addition, if it's applicable to your project, we ask you to provide the outlet velocity of the structure. You can use the spot tool. I've provided a link here on this slide to assess and document whether fish passage will be maintained with the structure you're using. If you have engineer drawings, it is also helpful to include those, but they aren't required. So if you do not have an engineer drawing, we ask that you provide a hand-drawn diagram instead to help us with our review. You will want to provide a project description of the location, including site coordinates, maps, and aerial photos, and identify the water bodies associated with your project. If there are multiple project locations on the same watercourse and within 5 kilometers, you can submit those on one form with a limit of up to 5 projects per form. You will need to identify the current state of the fish and fish habitat prior to carrying on the project, and you should include information on the species present, including species at risk, and the biological, chemical, and physical features of the project site. So for example, this could include types of substrate, types of riparian and aquatic vegetation, water flow depth, turbidity, etc. Proponents should provide comprehensive information about all measures that are proposed to avoid and mitigate potential hazards or death of fish, and you'll want to describe your erosion and sediment controls and any other applicable mitigation measures. You should also identify if you're using a code of practice. There is a note here that if you're submitting a project that is in an area of species at risk or critical habitat, but you could otherwise use a code of practice, then include that information on your form. Noting again that codes of practice in many cases are not applicable for use in areas with species at risk or critical habitat. But codes of practice are still helpful in that they provide detailed and upfront guidance on how to protect fish and fish habitat. Lastly, I mentioned earlier in the presentation that fish passage is just as important as physical changes to fish habitat. This requirement is not obvious on the request for review form, but I wanted to flag that all submissions related to water crossings should include an assessment of whether or not fish passage will occur at the work site. Lastly, it is important to include good quality photos. So we want to see photos that clearly show the water course, water depth, and quality of fish habitat, bank conditions, vegetation substrate, etc. We also recommend that you avoid winter photos if possible. So remember, our triage unit and regulatory review teams are not geographically located, and our biologists may not be familiar with specific project locations. So the first photo is a good example of an aerial photo with graphics showing the location of the works. It's really helpful if proponents provide aerial imagery with their structures overlaid. We are not engineers here, and that allows us to see the pictures in relation to biological and environmental habitats. The next 4 photos are good examples that show the watercourse, bank conditions, surrounding vegetation, and substrates. So we can't stress enough that we want to see photos and good quality photos that help tell the story. Before I move on to the next slide, one last point I want to stress is that it's important to be upfront regarding your project details in the request for review form. Let us know if you think your project will cause an impact, whether temporary or not, and identify as many details as possible. It helps us in determining the best approach forward and can minimize the time it takes to make a decision on the appropriate next steps. So this slide shows what happens once triage reviews your project. So they might request additional information from you if required. They will coordinate with species at risk and aquatic invasive species programs if needed. If they determine death of fish or to fish habitat is likely, they will refer your project to the regulatory review unit. And they may also issue letters of advice where there are no contraventions to the acts. If triage refers your project to our regulatory review team, Reg Review will assess your project and determine the type of regulatory instrument needed. The type of regulatory instrument that is used to authorize an activity will depend on which acts the activity needs to be permitted under. So in the matrix on this slide, the columns indicate whether an activity needs to be approved under the Species at Risk Act, and the rows indicate whether an activity needs to be approved under the Fisheries Act. If the activity does not need approval under either SARA or the Fisheries Act, then a letter of advice will be provided. If the activity needs to be approved under the Fisheries Act, but not SARA, then a Fisheries Act authorization is needed. In this case, an LOA for SARA might be issued. If the activity needs to be approved under SARA, but not the Fisheries Act, then you'll receive a standalone SARA permit. And if the activity needs to be approved under both the Fisheries Act and SARA, then the proponent will receive a SARA-compliant Fisheries Act authorization that also acts as a SARA permit. So we've been saying that triage reviews all projects under the Fisheries Act and Species at Risk Act, but there's one situation when the Species at Risk program will issue a permit, and that is only with respect to permits for research projects. So before I end the presentation, I did want to mention that the Fish and Fish Habitat Protection Program is currently engaging on the development of a number of new products, including a proposed aquatic habitat rehabilitation, prescribed works and waters regulation that might be of interest to this group. So we encourage you to explore the Talk Fish Habitat website platform. There's a link provided on this slide. So through that platform, you can get more information and register on the website if you wish to provide feedback. There are recorded sessions of our national presentations that have been delivered so far on the platform. And the partnerships team in Ontario and Prairie Region will also be following up with a regional session in the near future, and we will be sure to share the invite with this group as well when it becomes available. So thank you again for the opportunity to provide a presentation today, and I hope we have time for questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Danielle, for that great presentation. It does look like we have a few questions here. Our first one is, there are innumerable non-designated OHV and 4x4 stream crossings along the eastern slopes and bull trout and west slope cutthroat trout habitat. What are the considerations for decommissioning these illegal crossings if the decommissioning will improve fish habitat?
Returning it back to a better state than you started with, again, you got to use the tools that are on the website to figure out whether or not you send that in. Sometimes the issue is not returning it back to the pre-disturbance, like a better site, but how are you doing it? You know, if somebody's going in there with a shovel and a couple of kids with buckets, no big deal. But if somebody's going in there with a D9 excavator or grader and working on the site, sometimes the issue for us is not what the site looks like when it's done, is the work that has to be done to get from point A to point B. And I don't know if this answers part of the question too, is it kind of sounds like it's in with the species at risk question too. Look at the mapping, use the mapping to decide whether you got to get boots on the ground and get out there and look at it. And if you go out there and as a professional biologist, knowledgeable in fish and fish habitat, if it doesn't meet the form, function, or attributes of species at risk habitat, we wouldn't expect you to talk to us about it. I mean, we got a lot of species left in those areas. And around the, what was the question about the, there was something about motocross or something of that nature I missed.
Sorry, I was muted. There are innumerable non-designated OHV and 4x4 stream crossings along the eastern slopes and bull trout and west slope cutthroat trout habitats. What are the...
Yeah, I think that point there, I'll just stop you there.
Okay.
I mean, east slopes, bull trout, west slope cutthroat trout are high on our radar screen. I would say almost any activity you're doing in there, you want to do your due diligence. You want to look at the mapping, you want to look at what the habitat is providing and how it's contributing, and use that to make a decision as to how you engage DFO. Is there any more above and beyond the chat? Because I see somebody here had sometimes we have very similar projects that come back with different recommendations from DFO. Is there any official appeal process for these types of concerns? Appeal process. You see, folks, you got to stop confusing what we do with what everybody else does. We don't issue permits. The only real permit we issue is a species at risk permit, and that's for handling SAR species because you're dewatering an area. Appeal process, call the assessor, have a conversation. If it can't be resolved with the assessor, then you talk about bumping it up. So is there any real appeal process? In DFO, there really is no appeal process because it's not a formal process like a permit. And I'm trying to find the best way to articulate that to you. It's still somewhat of a reactive piece of legislation. It's not like a permit with a set process for appeal. I think that's the best way I can articulate it. I mean, I've been struggling with that question for over 30 years. I think we still struggle with it today. All I can say is on that particular question, if you have a file that has received advice from DFO and you're a little confused on the advice because you believe it's not consistent with previous advice, pick up the phone and call the assessor. Yeah. I mean, temporary could fall under anything. It could be a disruption. It could be a harmful alteration. We get alterations that aren't harmful. I think what you got to remember is the Fisheries Act, the way HAD is written, just think about from worst to least impact on fish and fish habitat. Destruction, you can't deny it. That's permanent. It's gone forever. A nice pike marsh where pike used to spawn on, somebody pours concrete on it, and now it's a parking lot for Tim Hortons. That's a destruction. Nobody is ever coming back to use that habitat again. When we talk about harmful alteration and disruption, really think on the concept of what Webster's dictionary says. It's temporary. At the end of the day, fish can come back and utilize it. Disruption and harmful alteration are a little different. Disruption, you know, an educated person could say, fish are using it this way. When the project's all said and done, this is how they're going to use it now. Harmful alteration is a little more difficult because at the end of the day, fish will come back and use it, but you don't know how they're going to use it, and a reasonable person can't figure that out. And I always give classic examples. I mean, a disruption, you got a bridge pier, you got some nice cobble that somebody put there years ago, walleye are spawning on it. You want to fix that pier, you want to de-water it, you work outside timing windows, you clean it up, you put it back to the way it was, and a reasonable person would say those fish will be back there spawning. Harmful alteration is a little tougher one. I mean, a classic example, you got a nice cobble boulder shoreline where you know all kinds of species are spawning there. You dig up that cobble and you leave nothing but clay or muck. Fish are still going to come back in there and use it, but not the same species and not the same way. And harmful alteration in that kind of scenario, when is that damage going to be repaired? It took hundreds of years to build that kind of habitat. It ain't coming back next week. Some situations, a good storm could put it all back. So think about those lines when we're talking about HAD. Everything is a HAD. Everything should be considered.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Rick. We have a few
Did
more.
somebody record all that?
Yeah, we have
another question?
Yeah, there's a few more questions here, but I think in the interest of time, we'll move on to the next presentation. And I'll send.
All right, we'll save those for.
Yeah,
we'll save them for the panel, maybe.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay.
All right.
Good.
So before our next presentation, we just have a short poll. So what is your affiliation? And you guys should see the poll pop up on your screen now. All right, perfect. Looks like everyone answered. So we have 32% government, 1% academia, 32% consulting, 27% industry, and 7% other. So our next speaker is Angela Bowditch, who will be speaking about the Water and Fisheries Compliance Program. Angela has been with the Alberta Energy Regulator for 5 years and is currently in the position of Senior Inspector for Water and Fisheries located in Grande Prairie. She is a professional biologist who has worked as a consultant for the oil and gas industry and for Alberta Parks as a land use officer. Without further ado, here's Angela.
Good morning, everybody. All right, can everybody see my screen?
Yep.
Thank you. So my name is Angela Bowditch. I am going to do a compliance program perspective from an oil and gas perspective. So from the Alberta Energy Regulator, who we regulate. I'm up here in Grande Prairie and I look after the provincial program for our compliance program dealing with water and fisheries. It's a little snowy this morning, but it makes me feel better that everybody else got a little taste of our 30-second spring as well. The Alberta Energy Regulator was stood up in 2013 under REDA, the Responsible Energy Development Act. We were formerly known as the ERCB and the EEV, for those of you who have been around a few years. The AAR in this undertaking accepted all the energy regulator functions as the ERCB, as well as those previously held by formerly known as Alberta Environment and Sustainable Resource Development, now in Alberta Environment and Parks, related. So we took over anything related to oil and gas, public lands, water, and the environment. So the relationship between the government and ourselves is that AEP creates policy and we enforce it. So the AAR is a quasi-judicial body and we take our direction from the province. Right now in our purview is oil, gas, coal, with recently added geothermal and hydrogen. And we look after those projects from cradle to grave. There are other regulators involved in some of these pieces, as you just heard from DFO, but also agriculture and forestry and Alberta Energy and Parks. The AER ensures our mandate is to ensure the safe, efficient, orderly, and environmentally responsible development of oil, oil sands, natural gas, and coal resources over their entire life cycle, including allocating and conserving water resources, managing public lands, and protecting the environment while providing economic benefits for all Albertans. When it comes to compliance regarding water and fisheries in particular, but overall, the AER conducts inspections, audits, and performance reviews to ensure that rules are followed. We also respond to incidents. So when you call the environmental response hotline, the 1-800 number listed here, whoever takes the call will determine whether your call should be directed over to us as an oil and gas incident or over to AEP as a incident not involving oil and gas. We have 2 acts governing watercourse crossings, the Water Act and the Public Lands Act. I won't go into it a whole bunch because we have Mike Hunka who will be getting more into the regulations in particular. We deal with an integrated compliance assurance approach. So for example, if we have a temporary diversion license where somebody is withdrawing water and it's a beaver pond, and one of the conditions in their license is not to draw down the water more than 10 centimeters, and they're in charge of deciding how they're going to measure it. We have some rules around how they do that. So for instance, if they decided to measure from the bottom of the ice, instead of from a set point that's in the bed or banks, that's not acceptable in our minds. So when we come upon a non-compliance that's fairly minor, or it can be higher risk, we can decide how we're going to handle that. Are we going to do education, which can be broad reaching? Are we going to do prevention or enforcement, or a combination of all of these? So we're always trying to select the best tool in our toolkit to get the best response for the situation. So we set requirements, as I went over from GOA. We promote compliance, we verify compliance, and we enforce requirements. Last year, our field program, my presentation more focused on our field program from last year, and this one will focus more on where we're going to be spending our time for the upcoming field season. We review our results after the field season, and those results help set priorities. We look at trends, we look at compliance, we look at public concerns, we look at federal concerns. Watercourse crossings in particular hit all of these metrics. So watercourse crossings are concerned both federally and provincially, and water is a huge deal for our public. Our compliance rate looking at watercourse crossings last year was 62%, which is definitely lower than we would like it to be. So in this case, this would be an example where we see that compliance rate and we know that we're going to continue to focus on watercourse crossings for our next field season. So for our provincial program, again, focused on the AER, we're going to be looking at water licenses, both temporary and term licenses, codes of practice notifications, Water Act approvals, and watercourse crossings. I just wanted to briefly touch on the Watercourse Crossing Management Directive. Currently, we have 39 member companies that are AER regulated. There are additional companies that are not AER regulated, but that's very impressive. So huge kudos to industry for signing on and participating in the program. For those of you who may not be as familiar with the Watercourse Crossing Management Directive, it is a voluntary directive. And the idea is that in 2015, we gave companies a few years to inventory crossings and take on the autonomy themselves, deciding where they're going to spend their time, their energy, and their money. Last year was our first year of data submission from member companies, and we've been very busy receiving and reviewing those plans that they have for the next year. That's as much as I'll go because I know Axel is going to touch on this as well. Again, our main concern is that we're getting money and time spent in those high priority watersheds. If anybody is here that isn't familiar with the directive or is interested in becoming a member and isn't one already, there is a great information package on the GOA webpage, or you can contact me and I can talk you through it. So watercourse crossings in particular for our inspectors, last year we switched over to using the AWCI app, the Alberta Watercourse Crossing Inventory. And in my next slide, I'll just show you a quick screen print of what that looks like. Our priority is placed on high priority watersheds as determined by the government, Stroller Order 2 or above, and non-member companies. Because we've given member companies autonomy to look at their own crossings, but in turn, because we've received data, we're also doing audits of member companies on their compliant crossings and data to make sure we're getting good data and that what they're calling compliant, we also agree with. That will be a combination of in the field ground truthing as well as a desktop audit. And we'll be reaching out to member companies to discuss that data, and actually we'll have an industry training session coming up at the end of May. So this is what the Alberta Watercourse Crossing Inventory app looks like. It's very simple. Some companies have elected to use this as their way of gathering data. Some have other ways, some are using service providers. But just to give you an idea, this app is for anybody. It's for regulators, it's for industry, it's for public. Anybody can use the app and it's super simple. The GOA has done a great job of producing videos to help explain how to use the app and what the different categories mean. But really looking at the app, you pull up the app while you're out there at the creek and you complete the app. And really there's only two main questions that are involved in the app. Is there erosion problems and is there fish passage problems? So I won't go into it in great deal, but as you choose what type of crossing, it gives you questions. And if there's evidence of erosion, it gives you options on what's causing the erosion. And it talks about structural problems and it gives you options on those structural problems. There's a place to put remarks and there's also a place to put pictures. So like I said, our inspectors switched over rather than using looking at things like scour pool, bank full width, we're leaving that up to industry to collect. We're just simply addressing the question of, is there a problem with sediment and is there a problem with the structure and fish passage? When we're out in the field and we come upon a non-compliance, such as the hanging culvert pictured here, I just wanted to go through our procedure of what happens from our perspective. We're out in so an inspector might be out and come upon a crossing, or they might be doing a crossing that we've planned for this summer. And just a note that we have said that we're not going to proactively go out and look at member company crossings for fish passage, but if we do see sediment erosion concerns, then we are going to look at those crossings and ask the company to address those immediately. So once we do our inspection, we use that AWCI app. The data gets sent over to the government as soon as we press submit, and we come back to the office and enter it into our systems. And one of our first steps is to consider it for triage. If there's a non-compliance, then the company will receive a notification through DDS, which is our system to communicate with companies, and there will be information around what action is expected from the company and what timeline that action is expected in. there is room for conversation between the inspector and the company. For this case, with a hanging culvert, we would expect the company to produce a plan for what they're going to do and a timeline for when they're going to do it, knowing that they need some time to apply for other approvals as well, as we just heard from DFO, submit their project for a review. And we also want to hear, with non-compliances, how the company will make sure that this doesn't happen again. How will they beef up their culvert inspection program? What will they change? So we want to see that change in behavior, so we're not back here looking at the same culverts or other culverts in the area in the same situation. Then the company completes the work and they close the file. We're more than open to hearing from you about projects that you may have where you're uncertain or they're unusual, and I'm always open to talking about watercourse crossings. You can contact me here. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Angela. Yes, we have a few questions. How does a roadway owner join the Watercourse Crossing Management Directive? Do we join the government directly?
So you will go to the government website to see the joining information, and then there's an email there where you can contact me. You can use this email, angela.babbage@aer.ca, or you can use the AER Watercourse Crossing email, but you can join through me, and I will let GOA Axel know that the company is joined and they'll be added to the program.
Perfect. Is there a mechanism for a member of the public to report a really bad culvert crossing on a fish-bearing creek to the government of Alberta?
Yeah, absolutely. Right now, probably the best method, if you fill out the app, the government receives the data, but nobody is flagged about it. The company's not flagged about it. The government's not flagged about it. It's one of the issues that we're trying to work through. But for now, that spill hotline is the best place to report it. That way it is handed over to an inspector.
Okay, and looks like that's it for the questions. I did see a question from an attendee asking if everyone should be able to see the questions. Unfortunately, it's just the organizers that can see the questions. But thank you, Angela, for that presentation.
Perfect, thank you.
All right, so our next presentation is by Michael Wagner. Michael is a forest hydrologist with Alberta Agriculture, Forestry, and Rural Economic Development. He has over 18 years of experience in research hydrology, forestry, and land and watershed management issues. The position he has with the Forestry Division focuses on developing policy and decision support tools related to sustainable forest management and cumulative effects for addressing water and watershed management issues across Alberta's forested region. Michael is also involved with watershed planning and advisory councils and various watershed stewardship organizations and initiatives. He is a registered professional forester and has a Master in Science and Forest Hydrology from the University of Alberta.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I'm just going to bring up my screen here and just get an audio and a presentation check here.
Yep, we can hear you and got your presentation up on screen there.
Great. Okay, thanks. Yeah, so good morning, everybody, and thank you for inviting me to share some information at this venue. I've given several talks in previous years on similar topics, and this year I'd like to take a little bit of a step back and make this information a little bit more general in the hopes that more folks will be able to take something away from this. So I've changed up my format a little bit, which is refreshing for everybody, I think, who's returning to this venue to get some new information. How do I work this? Here we go. Okay, so here's what I'll be talking about today in regards to resource roads and sediment. So I want to make clear that we're talking about resource roads, and these are typically multi-lane, single lane or multi-lane roads that are with or without a gravel surface, typically built with the materials that are available on site. These are used for natural resource extraction, oil and gas, petrochemical extraction, also forestry access roads. And so it's truly a great challenge to manage resource roads in the province of Alberta and elsewhere. We have hundreds of thousands of kilometers of these roads, both in permanent access routes as well as for temporary access routes to facilitate the extraction of these resources. And these roads can have significant ecological impacts to aquatic ecosystems if they're not properly managed. So I hope some of the takeaways that you're going to get from my talk is by emphasizing due diligence in terms of the proper planning, designing, construction, monitoring, and maintenance of resource roads, we can really get to a happy place or a good place in terms of reducing the risk of roads to aquatic ecosystems, both in terms of fish passage and erosion risk. And so one of the key points is if we can quantify or at least assess and prioritize and understand where and how much soil is being moved around on our road networks and potentially being delivered to our streams, we can work towards prioritizing and remediating these sites based on their perceived or actual level of impact. So I've got the legislation, the classic legislation slide up here. Angela spoke a little bit to the Water Act. I know Mike Hunka is speaking after me, and he'll probably touch on these things as well, but I thought it was important to bring up. So I've got two primary fundamental acts shown up on the screen: the Water Act and the Forest Act, and all of the associated regulations, codes of practice, or operating ground rules, which are embodied by these acts, touch on aquatic ecosystems and the management of soil conservation, soils, and managing erosion. So, within the Water Act or the regulation or even the codes of practice, we have, we have requirements not to create adverse effects on the aquatic environment. We also have requirements to implement measures to avoid impairment of water quality of any water body, in terms of preventing the deposition of deleterious substances which are toxic to fish, or implementing measures to prevent erosion and sedimentation into watercourses and water bodies. So with the Forest Act and the associated timber management regulation and the timber harvest planning and operating ground rules, which we're working within forestry to make some changes to and some updates, we also have those requirements, those legislated requirements, to avoid pollution of waters, to take necessary precautions to minimize soil erosion and to avoid pollution of water, as well as requirements to prevent impeding the natural flow of water in any watercourse, or to contaminate or pollute any river, stream, or lake. Within the timber harvest planning and operating ground rules, moving from broad to specific, the ground rules are broken down into specific chapters or topics such as watershed protection, fisheries in the aquatic environment, reforestation, soil conservation, and quite lengthy topics on the construction, maintenance, monitoring, and reclamation of temporary roads and watercourse crossings. The ground rules and the legislation on the Forest Act is specifically geared towards forestry access routes, which are legislated to be temporary in nature and are limited to 3 years. So, not forgetting about the other significant pieces of both provincial and federal legislation that we have, which make reference to providing protective measures for aquatic ecosystems, Public Lands Act, APIA, the MSSC, as well as federal legislation like the Federal Fisheries Act and the Species at Risk Act. Those are all important pieces that we need to know and understand the space which we're operating in. Okay, so why is this important? Why is sediment important? Well, unpaved resource roads are it's been well documented that they are the largest chronic contributors of sediment to aquatic ecosystems across our country and elsewhere in the world. So why is this important to you as a road owner or operator or a forestry practitioner? We have regulatory requirements, which I shared on that slide, which will be discussed later on by other presenters. But depending on where you're operating or where your tenure or your road is located, you're either in an area or you will be in an area that will contain aquatic species at risk. West slope bull trout or Athabasca rainbow trout are the species of note that we're interested in today. You're also likely operating upstream of millions of people who depend on forests and the streams that flow through them for a supply of clean drinking water. And it's likely that we all have some sort of professional designation, or the companies that we're working for have third-party certification, which is prescribing standards of practice or performance metrics in regards to these important topics related to aquatic ecosystems. And lastly, if corporate strategies or mission statements, have likely identified water resources, aquatic health, or biodiversity as a value on the landscape, which is important to manage. And so ultimately, one of the ways that we can understand such a large issue and manage erosion and sediment risk together at a watershed scale is really to participate in forums like this, to work together collaboratively to develop tools which can be applied in practical applications, and to share this knowledge and to ensure that this knowledge is being transferred across all aspects of the business. So this issue is truly complicated, and one of the reasons why erosion, sediment, and unpaved resource roads is such a complicated issue is because the responsibility of applying soil conservation principles and managing road-associated runoff is built into every component and phase of the development of a road. So from the planning and approvals process or permitting to its construction, its management, and its use, and ultimately the reclamation of that surface, all have components where we have to think about soil conservation and managing the runoff that's associated with these resource roads, especially around sensitive sites. For example, like stream crossings. Okay, so planning for road erosion. What are some of the physical drivers of road erosion potential? So can we even just look at the landscape and try to understand where we might have increased risk related to the physical characteristics of where we're putting our road or where we want to put our road to access the resource? And so we can look at these as drivers, right? So if you have a large area, if you have a large or a wide road, obviously you have more exposed mineral soils and you have higher erosion potential. And the same would apply for the access, the slope, the surfacing, the traffic rates that you're expecting, the inherent soil textures that you're going to be working with, whether they're fine or coarse, will dictate the practices which you put in place to stabilize soils and prevent those soils from moving. Maintenance is a bit of a tricky one. Depending on what type of maintenance is being done to the road, you could either be creating some high erosion potential, or you could actually be proactively managing and reducing it. So an example would be as a simple touch-up to reestablish the crown to promote diffuse drainage off your road service will likely reduce your erosion potential. But if you're reworking your ditches aggressively and clearing all the vegetation which has been established within that ditch, obviously you are creating potential for ditch erosion and subsequent transportation of sediments. So fundamentally, we can also look at this schematic and think about other metrics or tools that we can apply that would be useful to understanding and identifying areas of higher risk. These areas of higher risk would obviously require more detailed planning, on-site supervision, and follow-up monitoring to ensure that we're meeting our objectives around the protection of aquatic ecosystems. Some examples of this would be to build features into the road during the planning and construction phase that would help to manage runoff and minimize erosion. Another one would be to anticipate how much runoff you're actually going to expect on the surface, and either engineering or designing your water management or your runoff management measures to be able to adequately deal with the capacity. And looking into the future with changing climates, there's also tools and resources available that would complement anticipating some changes. For example, intensity, duration, frequency curves have been adapted to look at some of the climate projections to help understand some of the changes that we might expect in terms of rainfall frequency analysis, which of course would impact our design criteria for both our roads as well as our stream crossings. All right, so now we're in the construction phase. And really what we're talking about here is once the road is planned and of course approved, the construction begins. And really this is where the rubber hits the road. We all know this, right? So the goal of any road build is to build the best road with the least environmental impacts. And so we have lots of rules, which I've touched on before, and a tremendous amount of best management practices that can help us. Such as minimizing soil movement or exposure of mineral soils, right? Shaping surfaces to shed water. And I don't mean by smoothing out surfaces and creating opportunity for increased water velocities. We don't want to concentrate the water. We want to try to disperse it in a diffuse manner so that it doesn't have that erosive power to move soils, right? We want to manage our approaches of our roads going into our stream crossings, and of course adequately design our structures to the expected rainfall and stream flow. Of course, we want to implement erosion and sediment control measures during all stages of road construction and crossing development. There's a fundamental difference in between erosion control and sediment control. Erosion control could be trying to reestablish some vegetative cover to stabilize the soils. Sediment control, a good example would be the installation of silt fence, for example. So the photos that you see on your screen are, there's two bad ones and there's one good one. I think you can I kind of made a sandwich here. You can see some of the problems that I'm trying to show. The figure on the right is obviously a culvert which was undersized, right? I don't really need to explain this. It's too small. It's likely not been installed correctly and obviously not monitored after it was built, or the road was seasonally deactivated. Furthermore, this is a sandy site. And so we know that we've already got a challenge in terms of using sand or sandy soils in terms of the fill and bed for road construction. The image on the left is a bridge, and obviously bridges are preferred options when we're talking about altering stream channels or stream banks because they're clear spanning. But you can see on the image on the left that there's a substantial amount of material on the bridge deck. There's no separation layers. There's a hole in the bridge deck, and there were no silt fences, so no erosion control, no ditch turnouts to help manage the runoff that's associated with the road as it approaches the stream crossing. And basically what happened was a part of the road flowed directly straight across this bridge and into the adjacent stream. The figure in the middle is, it's an active crossing that's being constructed, and measures were put in place to manage erosion and soil movement even prior to the final road grade being established. So we can see that there's geotextile wrapped over the wing walls. There's multiple types of sediment control being installed in the near stream area, and the bridge is long enough so that the abutments don't restrict the stream channel, of course, but also that we have several meters of undisturbed stream bank underneath the crossing structure, which when this crossing structure is removed, will do a great deal of good in terms of the functionality of that near stream area. Okay, so two other examples. These are great illustrations, which were taken from the BC Ministry of Forests Road Engineering Guidebook, and I just wanted to emphasize that these are some of the things that we can do during the road planning and construction phase, but also during periods of inactivity when we might not be using the road. For example, in forestry, we have, we use roads seasonally in some instances. And so these are two very commonly applied methods for managing water and the runoff that's associated with roads and ditches. And if properly constructed, for the period of time that you're expecting, or the water or the rainfall that you might be expecting, how much do I need to manage for in terms of the site conditions, these can be very effective. So monitoring assessment, why would we monitor roads and watercourse crossings? Well, first and foremost, it's a regulatory requirement, which Angela touched on before, and I'm sure which Axel and Mike will touch on after I'm done speaking. But it's also a great reporting mechanism. So it's a great way to understand what's going on with the network of roads that you're responsible for managing for. We're quite familiar with this in Alberta. Angela spoke to the Alberta Watercourse Crossing Inventory app, which is supported by our Environment and Parks, which is a great way to have a consistent and robust way of recording your data. We also have the Roadway Watercourse Crossing Inspection Manual, which is really where the AWCI app was developed out of. And then what I'm showing is an example which is from BC. So this is a public dashboard on the right-hand side of the FREP monitoring results for water quality focused on forest and range management practices. And I know you can't see the small text in the screen, but what this does is, when you have thousands and thousands of inspections, or even hundreds or dozens of inspections, it allows you to look for trends, right? And so, the results from the culmination of monitoring and assessments related to roads and stream crossings can give us a really good idea of where we need to focus our management efforts on to meet our desired outcomes, right? So the results from this British Columbia program, which has been running since 2003, to look at the effectiveness of their results-based policies and legislation. A general consensus, the number one observation was, we need more cross ditches and water bars on some of these road surfaces. The contributing area of these roads is generating enough road-associated runoff to overwhelm some of the measures which are put into place. Another effective technique is spreading out your logging debris when you reclaim your road or near streams to prevent erosion. An interesting thing that the outcomes of this work was that greater berms are a significant factor in contributing to unintended consequences of runoff just screaming down the hill slope and being constrained by greater berms on both sides. We can use greater berms to strategically direct water, but in most cases, they're unstrategically directing water down the road and into the near stream riparian area. And so a valuable reporting mechanisms, it's going to help us understand problems and risk at a larger scale. It'll also help you prioritize maintenance and monitoring and assessment. Like if you put a lot of money, roads aren't cheap to build. This is helping you protect your investment and the environment at the same time. So maintenance, fundamental component. How you do your maintenance is really up to the road owner, but in my world, in my perspective, maintenance actions should be determined from the trends which have been identified through your monitoring program and or your risk assessments. These can be desktop based, which I'll talk to a little bit better or later, but they can also be field based, which is quite important as well, right? Going to the field and checking to make sure that your expectations are being adhered to are pretty critical. So maintenance can address those issues, which I highlighted before. Poorly developed crowns, which are holding water or not directing water off the road surface as quickly as they could. Improperly placed grader berms, increasing the drainage of the road surface, perhaps even surfacing or graveling roads in high-risk areas could help address some of the concerns noted during your assessments or your inspections. Of course, maintaining culverts and bridges was spoken to before. But the observations that we collect from our monitoring programs, can help us understand where revegetation would provide the most good, where erosion risks are the highest, and where we might have fish passage issues. You can also use your maintenance program. You can prioritize your maintenance based on some of the values at risk inherent to the landscape, such as the presence of critical habitat or aquatic species at risk, but also based on other risks that you might have identified within your organization. So the last bullet, I don't know if I can emphasize enough. The best laid plans of mice and men, as the saying goes, right? So you could have a really good plan, you could have a really good, well laid out road, but if your operator has a low level of awareness about the objectives that you're trying to achieve in terms of environmental outcomes, erosion, sediment, fish passage, they can drastically change the outcomes. So operator training, qualified site supervision is really critical to ensuring that aquatic ecosystems are managed accordingly. Best management practices. So there's a lot of them. There's a ton of resources available out there. Some of them are produced by governing bodies, such as some of the ones in the middle. So the Mitigation Guide for the Protection of Fish and Fish Habitat. This has a lot of good stuff in it, and it's not new. These aren't new things, right? So out of all the publications or the screenshots of these images that I have shown up on screen, my personal favorite is the Erosion Sediment Control Practices for Forest Roads and Stream Crossings. It was published by FP Innovations. These are all available to the public and practitioners at no cost online. But some of them are best, well, these are all best management practices, but if you look at some of the rules and regulations that we have, even across other jurisdictions, you can read between the lines and try to understand or recognize that best management practices are a really good way to help you achieve some of the desired results or the expectations of regulators. This is the how to get there. And there's new resources coming out, right? So Ducks Unlimited and the Forest Management and Wetland Stewardship Initiative, so that would be the FMSWE, I don't know what that acronym is, but they produce some really valuable guides for resource roads around wetlands. And I think that is going to serve us very well into the future, using that as a resource. And speaking of the future, you know, the good folks in the Alberta Watercourse Crossing Collaborative are focused on developing and making available to everybody a Watercourse Crossing Best Management Practices Guidebook, so you can stay tuned for that. So we have quite a few assessment tools, going from like a desktop base to a field base. So we put our boots on, we get dirty, you know, we go out to the field and we actually take some measurements. So working from left to right, we have forestry and FRI research have put some significant effort to developing spatial data products such as wet areas mapping, as well as a desktop-based watershed analysis platform, which contains some pretty good road erosion modeling tools, which I've spoken to on past webinars, such as the Road Erosion and Delivery Index, the READY model. And this goes a long way to be able to understand your risk at a large spatial scale. So you can prioritize and identify where you might want to do some monitoring initially. We have apps, which I've spoken to before, which are put into place to develop consistent reporting and data collection methods, so we can compare apples to apples across the landscape. There's also a whole host of tools that you can develop as an individual or even a forest practitioner or an organization using tabular or spatially developed data collection products such as ArcGIS field maps or Survey 123. And then the bottom right-hand side is just a screenshot of the program which I spoke to previously, the Water Quality Effectiveness Evaluation, which was created by the FREP program in British Columbia. And this is really, you know, I see this as quite a high standard, the gold standard to be able to make physical field measurements and understand the inherent risk of your road and watercourse crossing in terms of its sediment potential. So these can help us prioritize. we can begin to take some proactive steps in terms of assessing and managing our risk. Okay, so I'm already wrapping it up, which it looks like I'm almost out of time anyway. So I hope that there's enough time for some questions. But you know, I hope that some of the points that I brought across to the group, to the audience here, is that water and the runoff that's associated with resource roads and the sediment that is carried with that runoff really does matter. Perhaps these are small issues, but these issues are occurring everywhere across the landscape. So it's a frequency and severity kind of discussion. Perhaps low severity when we look at one site, but high frequency across the landscape. So that ultimately adds up to a big impact. Also, that resource roads are significant contributors to degradation of water quality if they're not properly managed. And we can properly manage this through careful road design, identifying inherent risks related to drivers of erosion potential, and then applying best management practices throughout the construction, maintenance, monitoring, life cycle of the road. That's really how we can effectively manage this issue of road sediment. And then hopefully I've highlighted some new tools or some new resources which are available to help us understand and manage the risk. And with that, I'll wrap it up. Thank you, and I'd be pleased to answer any questions.
Thank you, Michael. We have a few questions here. The first question is, the inventory and assessment of crossings are now mandatory to submit. Is a maintenance program also mandatory to report on since erosion potential is assessed during inventory?
Okay, so that's a good question. I think Angela touched on that a little bit. In terms of the requirement for monitoring within our forestry ground rules, we also have a requirement for forest operators to have a watercourse crossing monitoring program. And as a regulator, we have the ability to request the results of that. Now, that is for temporary roads and temporary roads and crossings, which are approved under our forestry legislation. Yeah, I like seeing the questions too, Rick. And so the second part of that question was related to what, Matthew?
So I'll just, the inventory and assessment of crossings are now mandatory to submit. Is a maintenance program also mandatory to report on since erosion potential is assessed during the inventory?
So I don't believe a maintenance program is required to report on, but there is an expectation, right? So if there's a requirement to monitor your roads, there's an expectation that you would have that program in place as well. And obviously that's going to come out by both, the practitioners' observations, which they've documented during their inspections, as well as the regulator if they show up and they start looking around as well.
Okay, and just a few more questions here. You mentioned temporary roads have a 3-year lifespan. What is the enforcement of ensuring that the roads are put back?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So, and that's specifically related to forestry access roads, right? So these are roads that are not administered or approved under the Public Lands Act. These are not formal dispositions under the Public Lands Act. And so the requirements or the measures that we have, of course, we have a rule or a regulation that says temporary forestry roads are limited to 3 years. Unless approved by Alberta. So there's always circumstances where you might need to have your road in place, and if solid rationale, of course, is given and the proper documentation or the assessment of risk is properly rationalized, then an extension may be granted. But how forestry manages ensuring that these roads are built to that timeline as well as properly reclaimed is embodied within our forest operations monitoring program. So we have forest officers, public lands officers are forest officers for forestry, I guess, but they're located across the province and they are out there doing monitoring and compliance-based inspections as well. And so we establish targets related to road and watercourse crossing inspections internally, and we go out and we do them. And part of that is to conduct monitoring on reclaimed roads and crossings as well.
Okay, and our final question is, how often does the data from the water crossing app get reviewed, compiled, and problem locations get mitigated?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I will defer that straight to Axel Anderson. I think he would be able to speak to that question much more elegantly.
Sounds good. We can revisit that question.
Sure.
All right, so we'll go ahead and get started here again. The next presentation is about Alberta's watercourse crossing regulations and permitting and will be presented by Mike Hunka. Mike has been a regulator since 2007, working as a fisheries biologist and senior environmental assessment analyst with Fisheries and Oceans Canada from 2007 to 2015, and as a fisheries biologist with the AER since 2015. Mike has experience regulating all aspects of oil, gas, and mining as it pertains to interactions with the aquatic ecosystem and has been involved with the remediation of barriers to fish migration since 2008. Without further ado, here's Mike.
Thanks, Matthew. Just confirm you can see the presentation.
Yeah, we can see your presentation and hear you.
Perfect. Thanks, everybody. Good morning. Thanks for hanging in there for probably the driest presentation of the panel, but it's important to get into the legislation so everybody's on the same page and understands expectations. So today I'm going to talk about watercourse crossing in regards to a regulatory overview. And as Matthew mentioned, my name is Mike Hunka. Been a fisheries biologist now for 15 years, I guess. And yeah, have experience working basically across Western and Central Canada on various types of projects, all from gold and metal mining in Ontario, all the way over to coal type mines, oil sands mines in Alberta, and every small little project in between. So definitely have a bit of a diversity in regards to working with a lot of Canada's various species. So today we're going to talk about the governing legislation provincially. So focus will be on just the provincial legislation. As we've heard previously from DFO, there is also federal requirements in regards to watercourse crossings. So it's important to keep in mind that you need to meet all regulatory requirements, not just provincial and or federal. So in Alberta, there are two acts that govern watercourse crossings, and they are the Water Act and the Public Lands Act. The Alberta Water Act governs how the province of Alberta manages water. The purpose of the act is to promote the conservation and management of water while recognizing the need for economic growth and prosperity, and to be flexible in the management that works cooperatively with governments of other jurisdictions. The Water Act governs the diversion, allocation, and use of water and regulates and enforces actions that affect water and water use management, the aquatic environment, fish habitat, and stormwater management. The Public Lands Act establishes the role of the Alberta government in managing public land. It sets out mechanisms by which the rights in public land may be transferred by lease or sale. It provides for and defines the powers of the Minister and the Lieutenant Governor and Council with respect to establishing regulations to govern use and allocation of public land. The Act and its regulations also control public land use through the establishment of public land use zones, recreational areas, and trails. The Act provides for the appropriate use and management of public land and for the classification of public land, of the public land base in Alberta. The Act establishes the authority of the Alberta government over the management of the bed and shore of all water bodies in Alberta. And so in addition, the Federal Fisheries Act also has regulatory oversight over stream crossings, which was presented to you earlier this morning. And this presentation is going to focus on the provincial legislation. However, the provisions of the Federal Fisheries Act need to be taken into consideration when installing and or remediating watercourse crossings in Alberta. So under the Water Act, all standard applications for watercourse crossings are managed using the codes of practice for watercourse crossings. The COP sets out the conditions for the installation, maintenance, and remediation of watercourse crossings. The conditions laid out in the code must be met for your project to be governed under the code. For projects that cannot meet the conditions of the code, an application for authorization under the Water Act must be applied for. Applications for codes of practice are submitted through the one-stop system where they are tracked and audited. If all of the conditions in the code can be met, your project has been deemed to be low risk to impacting the quantity and productive capacity of the aquatic ecosystem. And just a note, as Michael also discussed in his discussion, his presentation previously, erosion under the Water Act is defined in Section 1BC as an activity. So under the definition, an activity in this context means may cause or may become capable of causing the siltation of water or the erosion of any bed or shore of a water body. It is further defined under Section 1BD as causes, may cause, or may become capable of causing an effect on the aquatic environment. So when applying for a watercourse crossing under the code, there are several considerations that should be taken into account. And these are the location of the crossing. Under the code, water bodies have been classified based on the in-stream habitat and its resilience to perturbations. The timing, Alberta has established restricted activity periods for all watercourses, which are designed to protect sensitive life stages, such as spawning and rearing. Installation, the code sets out the restrictions and preferred criteria for crossing types. And so under the codes of practice, a hierarchy of watercourse crossing types are provided, which should be considered in the planning and execution of the watercourse crossing. Depending on the sensitivity of the habitat and the species present, crossing structures with minimal impacts to the bed and shore should be prioritized. So just a little bit more on the location. When planning a watercourse crossing, the location of the project should be referred against the existing watercourse crossing classification, the watercourse classification maps. Alberta has published a set of management maps to support the planning and execution of in-stream projects to prevent significant impacts to sensitive life stages. This picture here is an example of the Edson area management map with examples of the following designations of Class A, B, and C habitats. Class A water bodies are considered highly sensitive to impacts resulting from in-stream works. Class A water bodies are designated as critical to the health of fish populations utilizing this designated habitat and rely on these habitats with the within the designated reach to fulfill a critical life stage. Most Class A habitats in Alberta are known critical spawning areas, which if disturbed can have population level effects. And just as an example, in Alberta, Class A habitats comprise less than 1% of all of our water bodies. Class B habitats are also highly sensitive to impacts resulting from in-stream works, but are not considered critical to the health of fish populations utilizing these designated habitats. Class B habitats provide high-quality fish habitat that require additional scrutiny when planning and executing projects. Class C habitats are considered moderately sensitive to in-stream works and provide habitat opportunities for multiple species. Most watercourses in Alberta that provide habitat for sport fish are designated as either Class A, B, or C habitats. And we also have Class D habitats, which are considered resilient to in-stream perturbations However, improper works within Class D habitats do have the potential to impact downstream habitats that may be more sensitive. So the restricted activity periods. Alberta has established restricted activity periods for all watercourses which are designed to protect sensitive life stages such as spawning and rearing. Restricted activity periods should be adhered to where possible. When working in stream during the restricted activity periods, more stringent mitigations and the directions of an on-site QACE need to be incorporated into project planning and execution to prevent impacts to in-stream habitat and sensitive life stages. Release of sediment to watercourses can have significant impacts to the spawning success of fish during these restricted activity periods, as some life stages such as eggs and fry are unable to avoid in-stream changes in water quality. So here's just some examples of the crossing types discussed under the code. So in Alberta, there are 5 classes of watercourse crossings, which are designated as either type 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, depending on the installation method and the crossing location within the channel. So here on the top left, we have an example of a type 1 crossing, which are crossings that are constructed using a single span bridge that do not have abutments placed on or within the bed or within the active channel of a water body. And then on the top right, we have a type 2 crossings, which are watercourse crossings constructed using an open bottom culvert or a single or multi-span bridge with abutments or piers or other similar structures that are placed on or within the bed or within the active channel of a water body. And then on the bottom left, a type 3 crossing, which are watercourse crossings that are constructed using a round, arch, or box culvert or similar structure that are placed on or within the bed of a water body. On the bottom right is a type 4 crossing, which are crossings that are constructed as a ford or low-level crossing or other similar crossing where the crossing is constructed at or below the level of the bed of the water body. And I don't have an example of a temporary crossing, which is designated as a type 5 crossing. In regards to the installation of crossings in Class A, B, and C watercourses, the code establishes a preference and a set of criteria that must be met to comply with the code. Crossings in Class A water bodies are restricted to type 1 crossings for pedestrian or equestrian use only, and in general planning, any crossings in Class A habitats should be avoided. In Class B water bodies, type 1 crossings are the preferred crossing type, but where a type 1 crossing cannot be used, then a type 2 crossing should be constructed in isolation, and the crossing can meet the requirements of Clause A in Part 1 of Schedule 2, which I'll discuss shortly. And in Class C water bodies, a type 1 crossing is again preferred, or a type 2 crossing if a type 1 crossing cannot be used. And then alternatively, if a type 2 crossing cannot be used, then a type 3 crossing can be constructed in isolation as long as the crossing can meet the requirements of Clause A in Part 1 of Schedule 2. So some other considerations under the code. The code also sets out the conditions that apply to emergency works and the exclusions that apply during emergency works under Section 6 of the code. The requirements to submit plans to the director are covered under Section 7. The conditions that apply to temporary crossings are covered in Section 10, including the exclusion of the code of practice pertaining to temporary forestry crossings. The requirements for reporting under the code are covered in Section 13, including reporting violations. And the requirements for monitoring are covered under Section 15. Specific to the monitoring requirements, the owner must monitor a watercourse crossing in accordance with the plan prepared under Section 7 to ensure that the requirements of this code of practice are met over the operational lifespan of the crossing. So Clause A in Part 1 of Schedule 2 is probably one of the more important components of the code. Under the code, all works must meet Clause A in Part 1 of Schedule 2, which states, upon completion of the works, the quantity and productive capacity of the aquatic environment, including fish habitat, must be equivalent to or exceed that which existed prior to commencing the works. The intent of Clause A in Part 1 of Schedule 2 is to ensure that the works carried out under the code do not result in any impairment to the aquatic ecosystem. When carrying out works under the code, proponents need to ensure that the proper planning, mitigation, and execution of the works are undertaken to ensure that there is no impacts to the quantity and productive capacity of the aquatic environment. This requirement is also in line with the Federal Fisheries Act, which assesses projects' related impacts to determine whether the works are in line with the prohibitions against the harmful alteration, disruption, or destruction of fish habitat. When watercourse crossings are installed using proper planning and design, incorporate effective and proven mitigations and best management practices, and are monitored on a regular basis to ensure there are no malfunctions at the crossing, the quantity and productive capacity of the aquatic environment is maintained. It is important to note that the productive capacity of the aquatic environment can be impacted by the deposit of sediment as a result of erosion. Ditches and runoff associated with watercourse crossings are an important consideration under the code for maintaining the productive capacity of the aquatic environment, and by ensuring adequate erosion and sediment control measures are in place to prevent the deposit of sediment into water bodies. So now we're going to move on to the Alberta Public Lands Act. Under the Alberta Public Lands Act, the right, title, and interest of the Crown as owner of public land is confirmed. Specific to water bodies, the Act establishes the title of the Crown over the bed and shore of all permanent and naturally occurring water or bodies of water, and all naturally occurring rivers, streams, watercourses, and lakes. The established title of the Crown over the bed and shore of all permanent and naturally occurring bodies of water and all naturally occurring rivers, streams, watercourses, and lakes grants the Crown the right to manage and approve any projects that may impact the bed and shore. By establishing the title of the Crown over the bed and shore of all permanent and naturally occurring bodies of water and all naturally occurring rivers, streams, watercourses, and lakes, the Crown of Alberta shares jurisdiction with the Federal Fisheries Act over the management of physical fish habitat in all waters in Alberta outside of federal lands. Under the prohibitions stated in Section 54(1) D and E, the Public Lands Act states, "No person shall cause, commit, or suffer the doing of any act on public land that may injuriously affect watershed capacity, and the disturbance of any public land in any manner that results or is likely to result in injury to the bed or shore of any river, stream, watercourse, lake, or other body of water or land in the vicinity of that public land." And so again, specific to erosion, Section 54(1)F states, "No person shall cause, commit, or suffer the creation of any condition on public land which is likely to result in soil erosion." So underneath the Public Lands Act has been published a master schedule of standards and conditions. So like the codes of practice under the Water Act, the Public Lands Act utilizes the master schedule of standards and conditions to establish how routine works must be carried out on public lands to ensure alignment with the Section 54 prohibitions. Proponents conducting works on public lands must apply the conditions within the MSSCs in order to meet the requirements when applying for routine works. The application is considered standard when applying for approval under the Public Lands Acts, and no deviation from the MSSCs is requested. Standard applications are considered low risk and undergo an expedited review. When an application is made under the Public Lands Act that requests a deviation from the MSSCs, a non-standard application process is undertaken, which is reviewed by land use officers and other required subject matter experts, such as fisheries biologists, to determine the impacts to public land from the request and what conditions and mitigations are required to adhere to the Section 54 prohibitions. Specific to works in the bed and shore under the Public Lands Act, the MSSC sets out a list of desired outcomes and best management practices, along with the conditions which should be incorporated into the planning and design of your project. So the list of desired outcomes includes maintain natural drainage, maintain riparian habitat structure that contribute to water quality and maintain aquatic life and function, prevent soil and deleterious substances and materials from entering watercourses, maintain the integrity of the bed and shore, maintain aquatic and terrestrial habitat, maintain fish passage, and maintain landscape connectivity along natural movement corridors. Specific best management practices for watercourse crossings that should be incorporated into project planning and design include all weather access should not parallel fish-bearing streams within 500 meters. Where topography, such as the slope and elevation, limits the ability to locate roads away from riparian areas, access roads should be located as far away from the bed and shore of the watercourse as possible. The disposition holder should minimize the number of crossings within the disposition, unless doing so results in greater disturbance in regards to a footprint and/or negative environmental impacts than creating a new crossing. Stream crossings should be located at stable channel type locations, not at actively eroding areas. So they should not be located in bends in the watercourse. In respect to watercourse crossing structures, monitor road crossings annually consistent with the Roadway Watercourse Crossing Inspection Manual. Maintain and repair roadway watercourse crossing structures to ensure integrity of the structure and design. Stake, flag, or otherwise mark the location of culverts to prevent damage by road maintenance equipment. Clean culverts regularly to remove any blockages, such as accumulated debris that may restrict the design flow. And devices shall not be installed on watercourse crossing structures to prevent beaver dam construction unless the device design has been demonstrated not to impede fish passage. Study design and results must be publicly available. And all equipment should be kept clean and not be a source of sediments or contaminants. So under the watercourse and water body section of the MSSCs, the required conditions that must be incorporated into project planning, design, and execution in order to make a standard application are listed. There are a number of conditions pertaining to watercourse crossings that need to be incorporated into project planning in order to meet the standard conditions when applying under the Public Lands Act. Many of the conditions are periodically updated, as well as a few conditions that may have been added to address the sensitivity of listed fish species. So just some updates in the last 18 months roughly to the code. The MSSCs are reviewed regularly and updated as environmental conditions change or in response to auditing on the effectiveness of the conditions to meet the Section 54 prohibitions. Some of the new conditions are such as Condition 1408, which was added to address the increased risk of watercourse crossings in high-risk watersheds inhabited by listed species, which was updated in January of 2021. Condition 1408 reads, the disposition holder must install a Type 1 or Type 2 structure as defined in the codes of practice for watercourse crossings that maintains the channel for all Class A, B, and C watercourses. Condition 1408 applies to new crossings being installed in high-risk watersheds, which are defined by a spatial layer developed by Alberta Environment and Parks, and identify which watersheds are deemed high risk and requiring proponents to install a bridge or a bridge-like structure to protect listed species and access to their habitats. In addition to this condition, new conditions that have been added are intended to address new threats to the aquatic ecosystem. So condition 1419 now requires proponents to follow Alberta Environment and Parks decontamination procedures, which were developed to address the risk of introduction of aquatic invasive species. Condition 1419 reads, for use of equipment within the bed of a water body, the disposition holder must, prior to operations, follow the decontamination protocol for work in or near water, as amended from time to time. Condition 1420 requires proponents to keep and provide records of decontamination when requested, as well as during routine inspections. Condition 1421 requires annual inspections of all watercourse crossings utilizing Alberta Environment and Parks Watercourse Crossing Management Directive. 1421 reads, the disposition holder must monitor all watercourse crossings and report all findings by November 30th of each year as per the Watercourse Crossing Management Directive, as amended from time to time. And condition 1422 requires that the disposition holder must report all watercourse crossing remediation or maintenance efforts as per the Watercourse Crossing Management Directive. So thank you very much for getting through that dry presentation about legislation, but I'd be happy to take any questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Mike, for that great presentation. We have a couple of minutes here for questions. So our first one is, where work is anticipated around a non-fish-bearing watershed, and that watershed eventually interacts with a fish-bearing stream, how far upstream is considered to not affect the fish-bearing creek?
So that's a great question. So under the codes of practice, when we discuss classification of water bodies, the question here is related to where works likely would be happening in a Class D watercourse. That being said, Class Ds don't necessarily mean it's not fish habitat. So it's an important caveat there. But upstream from the confluence of a Class A, B, or C watercourse, that tributary would be designated as that classification. So if it's within 2 kilometers upstream of a Class C, then that lower 2 kilometers is deemed Class C. So normally work within that upper 2 kilometers could potentially be impacting that lower watercourse that it intersects with within 2 kilometers. But that being said, the question is in relation to how far upstream you have to be before you may not impact downstream habitat. And the question is really difficult to actually answer with a clearer answer because it's all relevant to the scale and scope of the impact. So, you know, if you have a uncontrolled frac release that continually is releasing fracking fluid downstream and you have higher flows, that impact can travel further downstream. So it really is dependent on flows and the actual incident itself. I'd say, you know, your zone of influence of that impact is well understood with sediment, which is based on concentration, the input volume, and the flow in the receiving system. So there is some probably, I don't know what the best word to use. There is some correlations there that you can look at, and if you want to really understand how far downstream it can go. But yeah, it should be. A general rule is definitely within a kilometer upstream is likely you can have an impact depending on flow and volume.
Perfect. Our next question is, how would someone get a copy of the code of practice maps that you showed in digital or spatial format?
That is an excellent question. There is no spatial format yet, as far as I'm aware. There's still just PDF copies of the actual area management maps. So they are available on AAP's website. If you do search under the Water Act, if you search into the codes of practice, you have to scroll down on that page and it will show you the area management maps, but they are not spatially available at this time as far as I'm aware.
Okay, and our next question, for a watercourse crossing of an ephemeral drainage, pipeline, or water crossing, is a COP notification still required?
So for a cross drain, a COP is not required as far as I'm aware. because you're not actually you're not impacting the aquatic environment in that situation. However, an ephemeral system still is connected to the aquatic ecosystem, so they're depending on the classifications under the code itself. There is some details in there in regards to the actual watercourse. You may still require a COP in that instance. If intermittence, most definitely. Ephemerals can be a little more vague depending on the actual structure of the ephemeral. If it's if it's a swale that only conveys precipitation, likely not. If it is an area that is potentially dry during certain portions of the year because of the slope of the actual watercourse or the receiving environment, then if it is connected to the aquatic ecosystem in any way, then you still potentially would need a code of practice notification.
Okay, and our final question here, from a regulatory and permitting perspective, is there any difference between a project that is restoring or fixing a legacy type of old high-risk barrier, like a culvert crossing, and installing a new crossing or conducting new in-stream activity? Is the former, such as old culvert barrier, expedited in any way?
So under the code, as long as you're meeting the conditions of the code, it's expedited. So it's not really relevant necessarily of whether or not you're improving the conditions. You still have to apply under the code. And so if you meet all of the conditions of the code for, say, a brand new culvert installation on, a crossing virgin habitat versus remediating a barrier, as long as you meet the conditions of the code, they're expedited at the same speed.
Perfect. And it looks like that was the last of our questions. So thank you, Mike. Our next presentation is an update on the Watercourse Crossing program and will be presented by Axel Anderson. Axel has worked in the forestry industry for over 27 years, 14 years as a forest hydrologist with the Government of Alberta. He joined the Watercourse Crossing program in 2021 to administer an $18 million program designed to remediate fish passage and sedimentation issues associated with roadway crossing owners by transportation and municipalities. And without further ado, here's Axel. Sorry, Axel, I just have to share my screen with you. Oh, you already got it. Perfect.
Just a quick question, that it's the right one? Is it the presentation with without any other stuff behind it, or?
Right now we can see your whole PowerPoint, including like the PowerPoint program.
Yeah, so I need to share my other screen again. I've got multiple screens here. It didn't give me an option. Maybe here.
Oh, okay.
Or maybe I can switch this perhaps. It doesn't give me an option on this end. Here, let me switch this around.
Okay, in your presenter notes, under the settings, you should be able to swap the screens around if that works.
Yeah, I'm gonna try here. Yeah, it's not really giving me options on this end.
Okay, then on the Go to Webinar under the Sharing tab, you should be able to switch screens. But if not, we could always just do it with how it is, if that works for you.
So I'm assuming you can see the PowerPoint software, not the the presentation itself, right?
Correct. Well, right now it's not showing anything. I think you have to share again.
Was that one there?
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, it really doesn't give me any options on my end. So yeah, I guess we'll have to go with this. It won't be what I was hoping to have as far as some of the transitions with it, but I'm sure it'll work. So yeah, thanks for the introduction. This last presentation really does focus on a slightly different scale than what people have been talking about to date. The emphasis really is on the planning processes that we put together to help guide where we would emphasize restoration of connectivity primarily, and then a little bit at the back end as it relates to focus on some of the sediment work that we've been working on over the last month or so. So as many people have pointed out in their presentations, this Watercourse Crossing Management Directive really is at the heart of work that's guiding our program and a lot of the other programs that are here. Mike did a very good job of outlining some of the new conditions in the master schedule of conditions that can be applied to new permits or new watercourse crossings in the high-risk watersheds. And that was a big component set out in the Watercourse Crossing Management Directive. There is a little bit more work to do as it relates to closing the processes to make sure that those would be fully enforceable. And we're working towards ensuring that we can get those done in a timely manner. The other big thing that this directive does do, and this is, Angela introduced this, it allows or outlines a process where crossing owners can do their own inspections, report their data to the government, to the respective regulator, and then to develop their remediation plans and submit those as well. It also gives direction to us, the regulators, moves us more into an audit and review process versus a focus on inspection ourselves. So companies that are voluntarily following this process get to do their own inspections and planning, which is then audited and reviewed by the respective regulators versus the inspectors doing their own inspections and going through the compliance processes that Angela may have did a good job of outlining before. It also talks quite a bit about developing a priority remediation index, and that really is the focus here of this presentation. It's on what is the process that we've taken to develop a tool to allow us to prioritize where we see is important for remediation. Understanding that crossing owners are expected to be compliant with all codes and acts and regulations that govern these, but that there is a legacy of challenges on the land base that are expensive to fix. And with cooperation and direction into particular areas, it will help focus our efforts and get the most bang for our remediation dollar. Really what's driving this, and we heard a lot about this already, the tagline from a lot of our other programs within Alberta Environment and Parks and other places is cold, clean, and connected water. And this really is targeted at restoring habitats for or restoring access to habitats for our native trout species that are listed. And we saw a nice map of all the interested area that the federal government has under the SARA Act, and there's recovery plans and action plans with all those species as well. The picture up here in the top right of the grayling of note, another big focus and another cold water fish species that's really focus of our program are Arctic grayling. And that really does make up the focal point and where we define where our high-risk watersheds and also where we define priority watersheds for remediation. And this has caused a little bit of confusion over the last little while, and it confused me a little bit too when I first started in the program. There's reference to really two different types of watersheds. They overlap quite considerably, so the range is similar. One speaks to the high-risk watersheds, and Mike Hunka talked a lot about those as it relates to permitting and actions that are required that are different in the high-risk watersheds. Those are not shown on the map here on the right, but really do encompass the watersheds in the foothills and eastern slopes. And those data are available spatially through our geospatial servers. They're also part of the LAT tool, the land use. I'm not even sure what it stands for, sorry. But the tools that are available to identify where we would find these high-risk watersheds. And what I'm showing here are what we've been referring to as high priority watersheds for remediation. So these are ones where these fish species that I introduced previously are present, and also where there's high road densities. So these are areas where a legacy of roads on the land base present a high risk to providing barriers to these fish from moving around the watersheds. Of course, so the next slide I was going to show here might be a little bit different because it won't have the pop-ups associated with it. But in the background is a screenshot from the app, the dashboard app that's been talked about a lot. And you know, those on the call, I'd encourage you perhaps to call in to be able to, or actually download that to be able to use it for a variety of different purposes. Very simple to use, as Angela pointed out, but does provide us a lot of really good useful information. Back when I started on this program in the summer of last year, or late spring of last year, I brought the app on my vacation, and what I'm showing here is in British Columbia. It's a nice example because it doesn't point fingers here at anybody that might own something here in Alberta, but it does show what happens with a lot of these culverts if they are placed in areas of, in this case, it's a little bit of a steeper stream, high velocity stream. This is actually where I grew up. And upstream of this culvert, when I was a kid, there was small fish that used this stream from time to time. It's probably what we would consider a small second order stream with a few hundred kilometers of mapped upstream distance associated with it. So really on the upper end of what we'd be targeting under this program. Still good habitat used from time to time, but not likely a stream where a fish is going to have its full life cycle in, but still very important for the function of the watershed, and to allow fish to use this from time to time as needed. And you can see on the picture on the left here with my son and my stepfather and our previous dog at the bottom end of this crossing, and you can see there's two culverts, water coming out of one, water not coming out of the other. And on the right side is the upstream. Only one culvert is now present. And what happened to this one was during a large flow event, some sediment moved down the system, plugged the lower culvert, which washed out the road. And rather than trying to clean that out, which can cause all sorts of problems, they happened to, the municipality here happened to have a similar sized culvert in the yard. So they brought one out, put it in a little higher up, and put the fill over it, and it's lasted for many decades since they did that. And you can see how this process might go on. The reason I show this one is not just to show what can happen to these, but what's happening here as well is the stream environment upstream and downstream of this area is being changed dramatically. So this sediment wedge on the upstream side of the stream really does impact the overall condition of the stream. And on the lower side, you end up with this plunge pool that you can see here, which is probably at least 1 meter deep in spots. And then you end up with an armored system down below where all this fine sediment has been moved out of the stream system. And I like to show this because as we go through the process of trying to identify the habitat quality of these streams up and down of these sites, it has been altered by the fact that this culvert and this road has been in place for a considerable amount of time. If you go upstream a few hundred meters into the property where I grew up, the stream is very, very different than what you see here. And it is on both sides of the stream has been affected by that culvert and that structure being in place and not allowing that sediment through the system. And we have that same process here in Alberta, and on our slower water streams with finer sediments, it can be even more dramatic. We can have upstream of these systems hundreds of kilometers, or sorry, tens to hundreds of meters of habitat structure change, where we have slower moving, siltier bottoms, and downstream we have that armored system where that sediment hasn't been moving through the system. And when we remove these and fix these, we end up with a large differential between the upstream and the bottom stream side. And that's a challenge at removing them, but also a challenge for the restoration for the whole stream system itself. The next slide here is one from actually just a couple of weeks ago back in Alberta, and not the same child standing at the top, but his younger brother, who's about the same size now. And you can see that these things go from what I was showing you before would be on the small end of what we'd be concerned about, to this is the biggest one that we have on our list as it relates to transportation's file. And this is one of two. So just to the right of this, there's a twin to this culvert. I really don't know the size of this thing, but it is big. And this was up until recently on our list of the largest upstream distance that we had that the biologist had identified as a barrier. When I went and visited it, I would question whether or not it is a true barrier, at least at the time when we were here a few weeks ago. You know, looking at it, it's pretty obvious to see that fish potentially could get through there. But this thing is dynamic, changes a lot. And you can see the size of the riprap on the side of it that's collapsed into the stream. It's probably on the order of 1.5 meters to 2 meters in diameter. Like these are big systems that move a lot of water. And of course would have the same sort of challenges, right? Down below, potentially a bit of an armored system, and upstream would have a bit of a sediment wedge. This is so large that it would be moving a lot of that through the system and not really providing that same problem. But these become enormous headaches that are very costly to fix, and even engineering challenges out on the land base that we have in Alberta. The next slide here has something a little more typical that we would be looking at. The one on the right, I'll talk about this one a little bit more. This is Levitt River. Now that we've removed the one that was there, and there's another one in the Berlin Wild Hay north of Hinton that is larger than this one, but transportation has put it on their list to fix in a few years just because it's old and falling apart, not for fish passage purposes. This one now really is one of the largest ones on our list that we're targeting to try and get repaired in the next few years with transportation. And another one on the left as well. So these things are prevalent. The processes are really the same if they're really, really big, or if they're medium size or small size. So this is really what we're talking about, or what I'm talking about when we talk about connectivity at these scales. Almost all of these challenges do come back to a culvert that was installed many, many years ago. They have been installed under different standards. Some of them do require engineering standards at the time, but when they did install them, fish passage was not likely one of the requirements. And then over time, through just hydraulic processes, through floods and other challenges, these things have caused this plunge pool at the very least at the bottom end, or may have been installed at a slope that will not allow fish through them at certain times, if at all. So these things are on the land base and can be extremely expensive to fix, not only for the government in this case, but for other crossing owners that are out there. And so I did promise that this conversation was going to be less, or this presentation was going to be less about the site level and more about the watershed scale. And so that really will make up the rest of this presentation. I just wanted to give context for the folks that were listening in to emphasize what really are we talking about causing, in this case, the red lines, which are areas that someone's been out and inspected and has identified some sort of challenge on the land base. Almost all of these come back to something, some sort of challenge that we identified there. There are other things like beaver dam blockages and those types of things. We would consider those more general maintenance and requirements, and not something that required a wholesale change of a culvert to a small bridge, or an engineered culvert structure that would allow fish through it at a significant cost. Before I do move into talking about the defining the watershed scale, I did want to take a minute and really try and emphasize my approach towards this. And I think it is a little bit different and perhaps worthy of introducing the concept a little bit. So at a watershed scale, and of note, we are talking about one single thing that is part of a much larger picture. If we do take a holistic view of what's going on in these watersheds and what might be all the pressures associating the fish populations, it really does become a cumulative effects problem. And in a cumulative effects problem, there's several ways of looking at this. And I spent most of my career as a scientist training people, working on scientific components. And I do take a rather, I wouldn't say unique, but a slightly different approach to it. And it really wasn't evident to me until I started working more professionally again in the last little while as to how different that might be and how that perspective might affect how I perceive the data and report on the data in the coming slides here. Generally, you know, when we start to put a lot of components together, it brings about uncertainty, and especially when we're talking about a natural environment, like a watershed or a fish population trying to recover. There's all sorts of things that affect it that we don't understand perfectly. And that uncertainty for a lot of people makes it very difficult to make decisions. And there's an inherent desire to remove that uncertainty. And this can be seen in approaches for modeling. You know, if we model a watershed or we model a population, there's sort of two camps on how we do it. There's a camp that is really driven to focus on removing uncertainty and trying to explain things with physical properties and equations. And then there's another camp that really focuses on conceptual models and trying to understand what this uncertainty does to our outcome and our decisions and our understanding of the system. And it really is trying to take that holistic view. So as I pointed out, you know, I was a scientist for quite a while. And, you know, one of the best things, one of the most fulfilling things you can do as a scientist is train other scientists. So in my previous career, I had 4 PhD students that I trained, 2 of them as an independent supervisor, a couple others as a co-supervisor. And this is one of the latest ones. Amy finished about a year ago and published a paper a couple of months ago. And it really does, you know, I just wanted to point this up here on the right. You know, we're not talking about predicting one hydrograph, but we're talking about predicting a series of hydrographs and embracing that uncertainty within the system to be able to define what might be going on as far as changes, in this case, to changes in precipitation patterns as climate changes versus what might be happening as forest changes. This is really doesn't have too much to do with this talk, other than the fact that as we move through this, the intent really isn't to remove this uncertainty, but to understand this uncertainty, to be able to drive towards understanding where on the land base we might have problem areas where we can direct our efforts to be able to get those fixed to help recover the populations, understanding that we're in this dynamic system with lots of complications. So here's a slide which will be a little bit hard to tell without having the animations come up. But I think it gets the approach ahead. So as we move down this approach, or as I started this approach to how we would address watershed scale connectivity, the emphasis really was on predicting on the land base where we might have crossings. And so how we go about doing this is we identify intersections between our map streamline and our map road line, like most other people would do. And then I tried a variety of different things. But really what happened was we brought the inspections in. We're receiving inspections not just from our process or the process that we're trying to standardize, but from a legacy of almost at least a decade for some folks that have been collecting crossing information on their own crossings to be able to understand what would be their environmental liability associated with these. And my approach was to take information in any form possible. So what I do is those little points there that are blue, red, and green, the green ones have an inspection nearby that's been received, but doesn't have any obvious issues with it as it relates to connectivity. The blue ones are question marks. They don't have an inspection nearby that we received, and the red ones have an inspection nearby with a question mark or with some sort of concern in it. Sometimes that's a tagged word like hanging, or sometimes it's a field that someone submitted and actually said that a biologist has been out and said this is a problem. So it's really embracing the uncertainty associated with the data that we have to be able to characterize what's going on in the land base. Ultimately, what this does is it tags where we think we might have problems and doesn't eliminate where we think we don't have problems, but at least tells us that someone's been out there nearby and that they haven't specifically identified anything that we can find that's wrong with that site. It's okay. Versus the other ones, there's some sort of keyword in there that requires us to look more closely. And the reason we did this, I just checked this morning, we have north of 10,000 inspections that have been submitted to the government in some form or fashion. Some of those are duplicates, but we're talking about tens of thousands of inspections. These are large numbers of inspections, and in order to get through all the data to understand what's going on, that's really the approach we've taken. And why we're doing this, and so this information is driving reporting, it's driving site attributes, and it's helping us define the watershed context associated with where these problems might be. Who owns crossings upstream, downstream? What are some of the challenges that we might expect within those watersheds at the watershed scale? It also helps the process that Angela was talking about too. So from a regulatory perspective, if you're operating under the directive, we can summarize all this information and give it back to you and say, this is the state of what we think you have, identifying where there might be priorities on the land base that we think we would like to have a closer look at, and someone perhaps fix it if indeed there is a problem. And if you're not operating under the directive, Angela and her inspectors, and on our side, the lands officers, can go out and inspect those sites based on risk or whatever process they want, and follow the compliance process that they might have in place to get those fixed. What we're doing internally, we have that app. We've heard about this a lot. Again, it would be good if you could download that and use it for whatever purposes might be need. We get that information, and it really does help us. We're driving that with field maps for ourselves, for our municipal and our transportation program, so we can see what's been inspected and where, and also direct people to sites that we need further inspections of. We'll be using a similar format for our lands officers on our end, and AER has something for themselves as well. We also understand that companies have very well sophisticated programs themselves that have been doing this for quite a while, and well-evolved data sets that would keep them compliant with the directive. And like I say, making sure that we support them the best we can to ensure that we're meeting the intent. So really what this is coming down to is we're trying to use these types of information to help define how plans should prioritize, or what we were calling before the Priority Remediation Index. And this is a site, that happens to be a transportation site, just pulled out as an example. It's got some upstream distance, some species have been found there before. It falls on critical habitat. And a biologist has been out there to say that, yes, this actually is a pretty good site for fish that we'll be looking at. It allows us to have some dashboards and things to be able to look at data. This is that Lovett River that I showed the picture of before, showing what's going on at the landscape level, who's upstream, downstream, all sorts of information associated with that. We're using that to drive our planning for transportation. And so one thing, in embracing uncertainty, the real focus here is not in understanding everything, but in what folks have called in the past or the 80-20 rule. So the 80-20 rule really does come down to the idea that 80% of your problems are likely coming from 20% of your sites. And this is easy to explain if in a human resources perspective, if you have 10 employees, often 2 of them cause most of your headaches. The flip side of that is the other 80% are not headache free, but they do require less attention to make sure that the work is done correctly and all that kind of stuff. So same thing applies to the natural environment. When we took over the transportation stuff and helping them, they estimated that there's 900 possible sites with issues just based on the amount of sites they own. We do have 1 year of surveys left, so the southwest portion of the province hasn't been, biologists haven't been out to look at all the sites yet. But out of those 900, we've managed to boil it down to about 120 that would have good or excellent habitat defined in the field by the biologists that have fish passage problems. Really what it comes down to is about 15 actually are going to drive recovery. So that's about 1.6% of the overall problems. And 9 of those are already underway as far as planning. And this is, understanding that we do have 1 year of surveys left, so that list might grow a little bit, but that is a pretty good number. Unfortunately, these tend to be the really big ones, the really expensive ones, but this allows us to identify these and put together specific business cases for individual sites that cost a lot of money, and then rely back on our annual budgets that we're getting $7 million in a year, and we've been committed for another $7 million for municipals and transportation to pick away at those other close to 900 sites that are out there that are good to fix and bring into compliance, but are not really the ones that are going to drive recovery. So that's a quick example of how we've been using some of this information to really zero in and identify where we want to spend our money, government money in this case, to fix sites, understanding that we want to be compliant in other areas. This example here, or this slide here, is something I put together yesterday, not the one on the right. So the one on the right, all the little Pac-Men, are really what we're hoping to show as reporting. So green is within a watershed, how much of it is above a crossing that has been inspected and there's no obvious issues with it. Red is one that's been inspected and potentially has issues. And then the yellow is unknown, currently unknown. So I guess in a nutshell, Pac-Man or we don't know what's going on yet if it's a yellow Pac-Man. And the best thing we want to get to is a round green circle. And you can see a few of those in areas where we don't have a lot of roads, are coming back with all those roads have fish passage. But by and large, we do have a fair bit of work yet to do. And on the top left here, this is just what I pulled together yesterday, and it is the on the blue one here is the percent of the watershed that has inspections for the crossings. So if a watershed has 500 crossings and 250 of those we've received inspections for, that would knock it in right at 50%. And then the yellow is representation of the Pac-Man. So that is what does that represent as far as the overall connectivity of the watershed. So you can see some of them are pretty good, right? We have well over, the highest one, we have a little over 90% data for all the crossings that are there. And that represents probably one of these upper ones. So we know almost 100% of the watershed as far as connectivity. So what I did for the next slide was I took everything with 50% or more of inspections, and I plotted those, in this case, of the percent of the watershed that is not connected. And so you can see this here, if this is 2015, one of these watersheds has 15% reporting of not connected, and it's likely, this upper one that's starting to trend down. I didn't want to focus on this too much because we're, as Angela pointed out, this is a new process and we're working through this, so we don't have perfect data on a lot of the watersheds. The one notable outlier here is something I wanted to talk about just briefly, given there's a few minutes left here. It really is one of the ones that we know a lot about. This is ones that we know a lot about, not necessarily because of our programs, but because the ACA and others have been doing inspections in this watershed for quite a few years, quite a few decades. So on the left here is a publicly available report that ACA, I pulled it off of their website yesterday, and the link to it there is at the bottom, where they reported from their field data in 2015, the connectivity of the Swan River. And you can see how they have shown it. They've got red lines where it's not connected, a little triangle showing the location of the barriers, crossing barriers, and blue lines where the map stream is connected to the main stem. And you can see on the right is a quick screenshot from the data that we have, just masking out the Swan River, showing a very similar picture. And I'm just going to zoom in here a little bit because I think it really does highlight the utility and the potential usefulness of this tool. The stuff down here on the north is quite developed and agricultural, and although this one red one here on the west side of the main stem is showing as red, the lower culvert has been replaced with a larger one that has fish passage with it. And I was out last summer or late summer, and I visited the upper one. And for whatever reason, it's fully backwatered, and I would think fish would be able to get through it. Not likely good grayling habitat in this case. is really the target fish species, but still, an important one to get reclaimed. That's still showing up here in our system because I haven't updated it. It's a municipal crossing. It's not something that we're too interested in following up on, other than to make sure that our data are reflecting it well. All along the east side of the main stem, which runs from north to south here, or sorry, south to north, is Highway 33. And I don't know if you noticed on my last table there where I was showing those top 15, we have 6 of those 15 sites that fall along here. So there's 6 large culverts left that caused barriers that were identified in 2015, and they're also identified here as well. One was replaced, not replaced under our program, likely just replaced because it was old and falling apart, or post-flood there was damage or something like that, but it was replaced under the bridge program that transportation has. This is zooming in. So this is really, I had to be a little bit careful in my screenshots that I don't show anything that might be incriminating to owners that are out there. And part of the reason why I showed the Swan River example, because as I pointed out, you can go to ACA's website and get a similar map to this that shows all these things are out there, including pictures and figures and all sorts of stuff that describe this exceptionally well. So here's a zoom in. We're getting a little bit closer to show the scale of what this tool might be able to do. Of note here, the difference between what ACA had done and previous ones and what we have done here is we've removed the first order streams and focused really on second order streams. And if there's time, I'll follow up at the last minute as to the justification and why we did that. And you can see this is the highway that's running along here with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 2 of these are smaller, and there's 2 other big ones just north of here. There's a lot of industrial and resource roads. There are some green stuff, and there's some plans that have been at work here as well. If we zoom in a little bit more, this is really where it becomes really powerful. So because we have disposition information, we can do the best that we can to tag this information with the owners. I tried to be a little bit careful here in emphasizing one particular owner, but often these can be a multitude of owners up and downstream of these crossings that really do require cooperation. And this tool has already really started that, whether it's municipal or transportation owned ones or industrial owned ones. People are starting to understand that we have access to this information. We may not be able to share all of it because some of it is sensitive, but if they phone me or send me an email, I can take a look at it and let them know who the owners might be and what would be the status of them, and get them in contact with the people that perhaps are doing work to see if there's cooperation. So it really is starting to live up to its hopes, although we don't have a lot of concrete data and examples without really showing incriminating components. And I don't have permission from a lot of companies to divulge their stories and perhaps their dirty laundry. One thing to note here is the little purple things are where we receive inspections. So you can see those. So even though we've really prioritized these larger streams for fish passage purposes, this does allow us to dig in and understand, are companies actually still inspecting a good coverage? And once they've understand the status of these things, if they're cross drains, not on permanent streams, a lot of these other ones are missed in the uncertainty of the mapping that we have and the system that we have. And so, it's still important to be able to take this look to understand whether or not companies are taking a broader look, or are they just looking at the ones of concern. It really does provide that opportunity to look at the data at very different scales. This one, I put this up because I wanted to just close this out in a reminder that, the programs that we administer, I've alluded to the one with municipalities, which is a grant program up on our website for any folks that might be working with municipalities. There's an opportunity for them to apply for funding to do their own inspections focused under this program, and then develop plans and submit for funding to remediate their crossings. Transportation, we have some funding that flows from Treasury Board to Environment and Parks through our program that then goes over to transportation, and that's that list that I identified. We'll be asking for more money there. We have a process to deal with companies that want to work under the directive, where a lot of this information would be shared directly with them, via the appropriate regulator to have those discussions after we reviewed it. And we have a program for companies that are not operating under the directive where those predicted points just go to the regulator and they do whatever they normally do with it with their inspectors. And we're rolling all that back up to a common component. This happens to be a rail line. So this is probably on our land base the biggest unknown that we have right now. We've captured a good portion of crossing owners on the land base. Trails are coming online under the new Trails Act, and we'll be working more closely with them in the future. But rail lines is a bit of an enigma to us yet, and definitely on our radar, and something that I guess maybe because everybody's busy, we haven't put a lot of headway towards this, but it is something that we're aware of. They do have a lot of significant things that have been around for a very, very long time, and in key areas that impact watersheds. So in the last couple of minutes that I have here, I just wanted to touch on, so up until that really was connectivity and showing the processes that lead to connectivity problems and the processes we put together to collect the data, use the data in collaborative planning, and also get the information out to the right regulator to be able to use it. And Mike Wagner presented this kind of briefly in his presentation on erosion and sedimentation challenges. This is actually the British Columbia method. And as Mike pointed out, I quite like it myself. It's something we've done a lot of work on previous. I mentioned I had several PhD students. I had 4. One of the last one just finished a couple months ago, and he really did his work on road erosion tools. So we have a lot of really good information on the science and how we might pull this together. And this, just as an example, this is probably something that we would be building off of the successes in British Columbia with Brian and David, David being one of my counterparts in the government, and Brian Carson being a longtime consultant that has supported this program for decades. And they've done a lot of good work there that we'll try and, for lack of a better word, steal some of their best ideas and try to implement them perhaps here in the Alberta landscape. To get a better handle of how we deal with erosion and sedimentation risk on the land base. And this was just a screenshot of what we've been working on over the last little while, is erosion potential. So taking that manual, using our high resolution DEMs that we have from LiDAR to be able to present where we have red dots, which are predicted high erosion sites where we would spend more time or want to see more frequent inspections of, versus the green dots that are predicted to have less contributing area to them, and therefore less likely to drive sedimentation challenges in these watersheds. The last thing I wanted to do here was just sort of put this in context. So I'm showing a picture here on the right of a couple of roads in the Upper Oldman, and here's those dots here. We really are doing this for the province, and this is where that uncertainty comes in. We need a tool that we can apply over most of the forested landscape and public land. We did it for the rest of the area as well, so that the framework is there. Just wanted to put the context out there that we are really looking for tools that we can apply systematically across the land base that work to identify where we need to go and spend our time to reduce the threat to these fish species. And then my last slide here was just, at some point in the future, being number 1 on our list with transportation now, I would like to give a presentation like this where this site looks differently. As it sits right now, it's just on a list to get the engineers to look at it, figure out what we might be able to do with it. But at some point, hopefully this will look much different. And in the Pemmican, which is currently closed to grayling, the habitat up here will be accessible ideally for grayling and other fish recovery. So I'd like to leave it at that.
Thank you, Axel. That was a great presentation. We do just have a few quick questions here in regard to the application. How often does the data from the Watercourse Crossing app get reviewed, compiled, and problem locations get mitigated?
So how often does it get reviewed? So I was trying to find a flow chart from a previous presentation to put in here. I just couldn't find it. I'm dealing with a different computer right now as we transition back to the office in a hybrid system. But our workflow is Currently, the directive asks that companies submit their inspections by November 30th. So not all of those have to come through the app, of course. That is, perhaps our preferred way, and or a similar format. That might get skidded a little bit because this was our first year, and it was a challenge. A lot of companies, a lot of inspectors were still working well into November and QA/QC in their data to get it in. So that's when we expect it. Data that comes in the app, we get it almost live, right? So we would see it. It gets merged into this process during the field season overnight. So this process runs overnight, and we get it merged into our database. When we would look at it is really through that winter period. So what happens is we're expecting to see the inspections from companies that have submitted theirs, any of the inspectors that have been out, any of the citizen science folks, all our transportation stuff would come in. We would redevelop our database based on the current base data that we have, assign ownership to those predicted sites. Any of those inspections that do flag it as concerns, because of our system, would raise it as a concern, either kicked back to the company for conversation if it's a company that's operating under the directive, or it would get flagged and given to an inspector for the following field for the planning cycle, which would happen. We would expect to see our plans in the early spring. We're reviewing those right now, and we'd be giving comments back to companies. So that is really the cycle that we're looking at. The hardest question to answer is that remediation, that back one, like when would it get fixed? That's where it gets uncertainty and all those other factors come into play, right? So depending on ownership, budgets, cycling, we heard about the permitting process here can be quite extensive. Engineering alone for transportation ones could be well over a year to 2 years by the time it's tenured and we actually get a proper engineering design that might be feasible before we even try permitting. So it really does depend.
All right, the next question is, as a municipality, we have to do bridge inspections on all crossings that are under roads that we own. Does this app replace the current way we do these inspections?
No, so, the best example I give is with transportation. So transportation would be similar, right? They're obligated to inspect anything, I believe it's 1.5 meters and larger from a culvert or bridge under different purposes. And so this often is targeting the smaller structures. And what they've done is, quote unquote, I guess, piggybacked it on their current inspection obligations for safety and other purposes. So, either hired similar or the same contractors, consultants to go out and then do the environmental inspection at the same time. If you get a grant through our program to do the work, one of the stipulations of the grant is you'll have to use the app so that we get the information and we can pull it all together. So I guess that's a long answer to say no. It doesn't replace your obligations to do inspections under the other programs that are out there. It is an easy thing to perhaps add on to the existing programs that are there.
Perfect, and looks like that's all the questions for now. Thank you again, Axel. We will now hear from Matthew Piper regarding the Watercourse Crossing Guidebook. Matthew Piper is an ecologist and science communicator who has worked on science communication products with clients across Canada related to land management, habitat restoration, and conservation biology. He graduated from the University of Alberta, where he completed a master's in forest ecology and a bachelor's in environmental biology. Matthew is the co-owner of Fuse Consulting, where he and his team work every day to find creative, engaging ways to connect science to diverse audiences. Without further ado, here's Matthew.
Right. Thanks very much, Matthew. I'm not having the option to share my screen right now. I've got the sharing button, and when I click it, there we go.
There we go. Sorry, that was on my part.
Now. Okay, I think everybody's seeing the main slide without the notes. Is that right, Matthew?
Correct.
All right, great. Okay, well, thanks very much for the introduction, Matthew. Thanks everybody for hanging around to the end here, and so that we can give a bit of an update on the Alberta Watercourse Crossing Guidebook that's being led by the Alberta Watercourse Crossing Collaborative. So what I'd like to do today is give a bit of a quick overview in terms of what we're planning for this work, and this includes looking at why a guidebook is needed and why supporting materials are needed, how we're planning to execute this guidebook, what you're going to have in your hand by the end if we're successful in completing this project, and then some of the steps that we're currently doing to secure the guidebook and this overall project. And that includes a bit of a request to help fund the work that we have proposed here. And I'll give a little bit more detail in terms of what that looks like. So just to provide a little bit of context for those that aren't familiar about what we're talking about here, ultimately this project will result in the delivery of a hard copy and digital guidebook related to watercourse crossings in Alberta. There would be a series of video tutorials that would come with it, as well as a mobile application. So I'll provide a little bit more context throughout the presentation on that. I think it's important that we maybe start with the question of why a guidebook and why the need for various supporting materials. And what we've been hearing from various individuals in a wide range of organizations is that we have a number of progressive practices that are readily available, but they're not always being leveraged. And Michael Wagner gave a great presentation just showcasing different examples where best practices are being implemented, and then maybe some opportunities where we could be leveraging better techniques on the landscape. We've also heard that information about crossings is contained across a diversity of documents. Sometimes it's embedded within regulatory documents and policy documents. Sometimes it's within best practices documents. Sometimes it's even just within the heads and the hands of our practitioners who have that field experience and on-the-ground experience in terms of implementing these crossings in really robust ways. And so there's really a belief among a wide range of individuals and organizations, including the AWC3 team, that if we can bring these resources together, we can really leverage good communication techniques, we can leverage good knowledge that's out there, and we can hopefully have a lasting impact on creek crossings and fish habitat connectivity. And when I say there's interest from diverse parties, we have significant support for this work already. We have received letters of support from the Alberta Energy Regulator, from Alberta Environment and Parks, from Alberta Agriculture, Forestry and Rural Economic Development, as well as Alberta Transportation. And we also have significant interest from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, from forest and energy industry representatives, as well as many consultants who are on this call here in terms of their interest in having some of these tools made available for on-the-ground implementation. So there's a lot of excitement in terms of what we can hopefully achieve with this project. And to help us dive a little bit deeper into why a product like this is really needed, we can look at a figure like this that shows the diffusion of innovation. Essentially what this figure is showing is how do new ideas and best practices actually become readily adopted, and how do we actually reach a tipping point where it's not just our innovators and our early adopters that are doing practices on the ground. We reach a tipping point where essentially all of the people operating on the ground are using these good practices. And what this graph shows and what this principle of the diffusion of innovation demonstrates is that there's a number of individuals that are classified as innovators, where they quickly adopt new ideas, and they're the ones that are really out there first testing some of these new ideas. And then there's also the early adopters that follow those innovators. They like to be readily applying some of these new techniques. And so these are generally considered some of our more progressive organizations or progressive individuals on the landscape. But from psychology, we know that there can often be this what's called a chasm between the early adopters and the early majority. And that chasm really requires innovative approaches to kind of bridge that gap and ensure that these practices become more widely adopted. And in a nutshell, what we're really trying to do is find ways to reach a tipping point where we have the early majority and the late majority also applying some of these practices, and that we're seeing significant changes in terms of the use of best practices and the performance of creek crossings on the landscape. So what we want to do with this work is that we want to empower practitioners with the information that they need to give them the confidence to apply these progressive practices. And we want to see those positive outcomes for watercourse crossings on the landscape. And there's some existing precedents for this work. In 2012, Tim Vinge, colleague at the Government of Alberta, as well as myself, we developed a visual guide for the management of woody materials on reclamation sites. And at the time, the industry and regulated standard was in forested landscapes, trees were cleared from industrial sites, the woody materials were then piled up and they were burned. And through synthesis of the science, through conversations with regulators, through drawing on knowledge of on-the-ground practitioners, we were able to develop a guide that helped transition us through that chasm into a practice that's now used as the standard practice across reclaimed sites in the boreal region of Alberta. And there's many other examples like this, and I think it provides evidence that the system that we're talking about here with this guidebook can really work for us and for the discipline as a whole. So that's a little bit in terms of the motivation and why we're so keen to take on this project and to execute this project, and why there's so much interest from diverse parties. The next step we wanted to talk about is how are we actually going to execute it, and what are some of the steps that we're undertaking. So we're proposing to deliver this work through 3 core phases. Phase 1, the deliverable would be a completed guidebook with government and regulator endorsement. So this step will involve pulling together all the information from documents, from existing regulatory documents, etc., and also leveraging the knowledge of practitioners through workshops. Our team at Fuse Consulting would then use our science communication and science illustration skills to really build a guidebook that's engaging and relevant to an operational audience. The second phase of the work would be to complete up to 20 to 25 videos that showcase key techniques. And we want to really leverage videos to showcase installation techniques in the field. We want to show them being applied in a range of different settings. And there's a large number of installations that are being planned for this summer and that are projected for next summer. So we want to leverage that opportunity to develop a video library that, again, showcases techniques, and it empowers people to make use of some of these best practices that are available. And the final stage, stage 3, is to pull this all together into a mobile app and web platform that can be used while in the field. So we're really trying to provide another opportunity to embed this information into practices and to make use of that information in the field. Now, one of the things that you'll see or hear from me here is the emphasis on creating a visual guide and the use of videos. And, frankly, we know that if we create, say, a text-based encyclopedia of best practices, it's really going to limit the uptake and use. And so through our experiences, we know that people process information far better when there's visual information to help guide them. So almost 50% of our brains are involved in visual processing. 70% of all your sensory receptors are in your eyes. And we can get the sense of a visual scene in less than 1/10 of a second. And so we want to take some of this knowledge and really apply this information so that we can make the guidebook highly usable, very sticky, so that people are actually applying this on the landscape. And we also know that people do better when they have visuals to guide them. So science has shown us that people following directions with text and illustrations do 323% better than people following directions without illustrations. And I like to use the example that if you consider the experience of building IKEA furniture, imagine the success of the IKEA business model if they provided just text-based instructions. So these are some of the techniques in the use of visuals that we want to leverage in the development of this guidebook and these videos to really make sure the practices are seen and applied in the field. So what will you have in hand at the end of this project? Again, essentially, we're working towards a hard copy and digital version of a guidebook, a series of video tutorials, as well as a mobile application. And the steps that we're using to actually secure the guidebook we wanted to give a bit of a glimpse in terms of where we're at in the process and some of the steps that we're following. So we've developed a detailed project plan that includes workshops with practitioners, getting out into the field with experts and with government regulators, and review of various materials that are available. So synthesizing that information. We also know that a number of individuals have very high expectations and high hopes for this project. And we want to ensure that the deliverables that we produce are matched to those expectations and that capitalize on the opportunity and the interest in this project. So we've developed a total budget for this project of $350,000, and that would be delivered over the course of 2 years. This includes a budget of about $115,000 for the guidebook itself, about $150,000 to secure a professional videographer to develop professional videos, and then approximately $65,000 for the mobile app and the website development. At this point right now, we have about $138,000 in verbal confirmations from energy and forestry supporters. We've also put in an application to the DFO Habitat Stewardship Program for $100,000, and that proposal is currently in review, and we expect to hear whether we were successful with that application any day now. And so that leaves about $112,000 remaining in terms of funding needed. And so there is an opportunity, if you see that this is relevant to your organization, if you're motivated to help us make this become a reality, we're currently looking to secure that additional funding. And depending on whether or not we're successful with that DFO application, that would also dictate our next steps in terms of fundraising. In terms of oversight and management, the project oversight will be by the AWC3 board. So they'll be the ones that are ultimately overseeing the financial control and the overall strategy of this. And then our team here at Fuse Consulting would be charged with the project implementation, the project management, and the overall communications. So hopefully that's a helpful update to folks. Again, if this piques your interest, or if there's you think that this might benefit your organizations in terms of helping support the development of this, you can either reach out to the AWC3 team or directly to myself, and we'd be happy to answer any other questions and talk about what opportunities there might be there to support this work. And that's everything for me today, and happy to take any questions that you might have.
Perfect. Thank you, Matthew. So we'll now go to our Q&A period. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat. And if your question is directed at someone specifically on our panel, just mention that in your question, please. Thank you. All right, so we have a few questions that were asked during the DFO presentation. So we'll just go ahead and answer those now. So
sure, it's Rick Kerlick. I'm here. I came back. I stayed on for most of the presentations, so I got a feel for what happened this afternoon. Okay. Yeah, we had some questions there that I needed to read them. So they've been emailed to me. I'll just go through them, and I've got it here, so I'll just read it out. Is there a best management practice referral documents for codes of practice that DFO recommends? Somebody had POE. I'm assuming they mean the pathway of effects that's on our website. So the short answer to that question is no. DFO is not going to dictate how you do it. We just want to see the end result. So when it comes to sediment and erosion, this question was about sediment and erosion control and stream activities. And because again, at the end of the day, we're dealing with several provinces. Every province has a plethora of information and best management practices for erosion control. The only thing DFO is looking for is to be in compliance. And to be in compliance, don't let sediment go into the creek, because it's seen as a deleterious substance. But then we don't want to see it reach a point where it becomes a HAD, a harmful alteration, disruption, destruction. We are not, you have to remember, the provinces are looking at things from a different lens than we are. Our lens is very broad. Our lens is Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and even though we're called Ontario's Prairie, we're still handling files for the Arctic region because they're not up and running to have staff in place. So the short answer is, when it comes to best management practices for sediment control, the provinces have the best guidelines available. The internet has a plethora of information about sediment and erosion control. Use those, achieve the endpoint that we're looking for, and that is the best I can answer on that question for you. Any subsequent questions, response? Move on to the next ones?
Sure.
I'm looking at my, I'm not looking at the, what's it called, the GoToWebinar, so I don't see if anything's coming up. I'm just sticking with the email there. I just got one screen. I'm a simple guy, I just use one screen. There was some subsequent questions there. Let me see, where were they? Oh yeah, I think this one was asked, and I think I tried to answer it a little bit. So this thing about sometimes we have very similar projects that come back. We seem to get different answers. Is there any official appeal process? The bottom line is, you know what? We've got a fairly large organization. We try our best to be as consistent as possible. We're all human. Sometimes we miss something. The appeal process, you have an assessor's name, call them. If you can't get hold of the assessor, call the triage line, email triage. That's the question around similar projects with different recommendations. Is there an appeal process? Next question I have here is, there's lots of non-designated off-road vehicle 4x4 stream crossings along the eastern slopes and bull trout, west slope cutthroat trout habitat. What are the considerations for decommissioning these illegal crossings? If decommissioning will improve fish habitat? You know, this is somewhat similar of the earlier question we had that I answered this morning, was that, you know, I want to do a project and at the end of the day, it's going to be a net benefit. Well, that's wonderful. Use the tools that are in our system. Even this one here, I would say the same thing. We have the mapping tools. Look at the mapping tools. Look at the species at risk maps. Recognize that those are very conservative and very broad. Utilize those to make a decision that you need to get on the site. Get on the site, boots on the ground. If at the end of the day, it doesn't meet the needs of habitat for species at risk, again, using that form, function, attributes, one should be able to assess it without getting DFO involved. And the considerations would be no different than any other project. You have to consider it under the Fisheries Act. You have to consider it under the Species at Risk Act. Look at the website, look at the tools we have. And again, remember, there is nothing in the Fisheries Act that says thou shalt come to DFO to get a review. It says be in compliance and utilize the tools on the website to be in compliance. And if at the end of the day you're still not clear, then it's your due diligence, or it behooves you to submit a request for review. Next question. Is it beneficial to include correspondence and recommendations from the provincial regulators when submitting projects? Absolutely. Absolutely. It's very beneficial. We try our best to communicate with our partners in the province. I'll give you a classic example. When people write us and they send in a request for review and they want to work during a restricted activity period or a timing window, at the end of the day, we're not the fisheries managers. The provincial biologists are the fisheries managers. Do your homework ahead of time if there's going to be an issue about working during those periods. that are in place to protect spawning and nursery periods. Talk to the province first. Find out if they have a file. Provide us with any correspondence. Whatever you can do to help us get our work done is going to help us move the project through our system. So short answer to that one, yes. Anything you have from the provincial regulators, provide that with your submission to DFO. Their next question was a little bit, you can cut me off at any time, because again, I'm just reading it off my email message if there's another subsequent question from the one I just answered. The next one we had here, when the work area is frozen to the bottom during a work period, and the crossing structure will be completed during this time, so habitat would not be affected. Would DFO need a notification? These are very common of intermittent or small crossings in northern Alberta, and are always in question. I mean, we're getting into the weeds here. I mean, every project is different. In general, I would think that if a system is intermittent, frozen to the bottom, by the end of the day, when the project's said and done, you would be able to mitigate and still be in compliance with the Act. So again, it's the same answer. Go to the website. I mean, the scale of the works. I mean, if you're working in an area that's designated as species at risk for whatever reason, for critical habitat, and maybe the on-site doesn't meet it, again, go out there and assess it. Is it a straight answer? Yes, frozen to the bottom. Well, site-specific, project-specific. I know that's the government answer, folks, but that's the best I can do for you. What was the next one we had? A couple of engineering consultants are openly completing numerous bridge and culvert replacements using a self-assessment methodology, clear despite habitat impacts. What are your thoughts on that? What are your recommendations for professionals who identify this issue? Well, is that any different than somebody out there working on fish habitat that's maybe caused a had? That, I mean, this almost sounds like, I mean, this is like snitching on your neighbor. Sorry to put it that way, folks, but I've been at this job a long time. I've lost a lot of my filter. But again, reach out to DFO if you're concerned as a Canadian citizen, as a member of the public, about how somebody's undertaking works that could impact fish and fish habitat or species at risk. There is a process to notify us. It's on our website. Follow that process. Contact the triage team through the website with the details, and then we'll respond to it. What's this next one? Oh, I don't see anything. But the last question I had here about DFO and Sarah involved in monitoring enforcement of regulations. I see more and more motorized stream crossings and critical habitat again in the eastern slopes. Well, just a general question, and I'll come back to the eastern slopes, because the eastern slopes with bull trout and western cutthroat trout is definitely high on our radar screen. So just on the basic of species at risk, we do have between the regulatory review units, the biologists, and our fishery officers, there is a regular program every year. Randomly, they select where we have issued such SARE permits, species at risk permits. And typically, again, those would be projects where the work itself, like a culvert replacement or culvert repair, may not require an authorization under the Fisheries Act. It's probably just a letter of advice. But then again, if somebody's in occupied habitat for federally listed species at risk and they're dewatering, there's the potential to handle aquatic species that are under DFO species at risk list, and a permit is required. So there is a regular program of our fishery officers specifically inspecting species at risk permits. And we have over the few years ramped up our monitoring program. Our the main core of the program, for those of us familiar with DFO in Alberta, our monitoring team, the manager, Court Berryman, is centered out of Edmonton. We have crews in Edmonton, Winnipeg, Burlington. So there is a regular program of monitoring that has been going on. Of course, the last 2 years, I hope everybody appreciate that's been a little problematic with COVID and with pandemic lockdown. But that is how the monitoring is done. We have a monitoring team. We have a monitoring program. We do an annual poll or survey of our data set where we keep all our file reviews to develop a plan. And areas like the eastern slopes that are high profile are very much part of that plan. And even the question of, I see more and more motorized crossings. We consistently get calls to our triage inbox and notifications. We do follow up on those. We usually follow up with the province first to get local information. And if needed, we bring in the fishery officers if something needs to go forward. So that was the last question I had in the list I got from Matthew. Any more come up or any subsequent while I was talking?
Yeah, it looks like there's one more here that pertains to DFO. Would more
Okay.
Yeah, it looks like there's one more here, Rick.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Would more complicated projects that involve SARA species bypass the request for review process because it is apparent they would be flipped to a HAD anyway, and would avoid the 90-day review period to increase approval timelines that would provide a net benefit in a more timely manner? Approval timelines could make a positive effect. Is 500 days to get a project approved deemed timely?
So let me first back up here that let me explain what these time periods mean. And the 500-day, I'm not quite sure where that's coming from, because you got to remember, we see a variety of projects that come in here. We see a broad range of everything that's a simple turnaround letter of advice to something that could be in a panel review, impact assessment agency. So let me start with the first question there. The Fisheries Act has gone through some changes. You know, the really key things that have really come in are things like Indigenous consultation. I'm not even going to tell you the story of the time I've been in the program and how that's changed so often with changes of government. So it's very important because of how Indigenous consultation is now played into the program. The whole business around letters of credit. You're not doing yourself any favors by jumping right to an application for authorization or a SARA permit. You got to let us do our job first. And I'm trying to think of the best way to explain this is with the changes to the legislation too recently and the changes to the overall program, we have a lot of oversight. And a lot of that oversight is before biologists can render a decision to a proponent, like something needs a Fisheries Act authorization or something needs a SAR permit, you have to understand and respect that we have some internal processes that we have to follow. And, you know, like I said, I've been in this job a long time. I worked in the early 90s, right up until the ramp up. And, you know, there's pluses and minuses about some of the process we have now. To some certain level, it does probably maintain some level of consistency. So, and I think, I don't know if Danielle covered it in her presentation, I think she did a little bit, is that we don't want you jumping right to a Fisheries Act application or SAR permit. Send in the request for review. Let us do our job. Let us do our job internally before we decide it needs a Fisheries Act authorization. Because deciding something needs a Fisheries Act authorization is not a, trying to think of a word, a frivolous decision. There's a lot of moving parts, and the big moving parts are the letter of credit. You know, now we have the Fisheries Act authorization has changed a lot. We have contingency planning. It's not as simple as straightforward as it used to be. So you throw all these things in the mix. We really encourage you start with the request for review. Now let's talk about these timelines that are legislated. So from the moment we receive an application for authorization, the clock starts. So the first clock is 60 days. So we have 60 days to tell a proponent that their application is complete or incomplete. And you know, my experience has been since that clock came in, I mean, that came in 2012 under the Conservative government, and it was maintained during the changes to the Act. Somebody taking 60 days to tell somebody their application is incomplete, I mean, hardly ever gets used. That is not the big issue. The big issue is the 90-day clock. The 90-day clock is the one that, so 60-day, you submit your application for authorization. We have 60 days to confirm the completeness or incompleteness of it. Then once that clock is done, the application is complete. We have 90 days to conduct and complete Indigenous consultation to allow the project to go forward. In most cases, those two cross over each other. It's not a hard and fast rule. So I'm not sure where the question about the 500th day comes. Only time I could ever think of that happening in my career in this program is a major mine that has, you know, Indigenous consultation, impact assessment agency, federal impact assessment. When it comes to day-to-day Fisheries Act stuff and Fisheries Act application, my experience has been the 60 and 90-day clock. And let me tell you something, yes, those can get dragged out sometimes. If something comes up in the project with review, with Indigenous consultation, and there's some level of accommodation going on, the clock gets stopped and then it gets restarted. So I wouldn't get too hung up on the day, the day thing, because that is, you see what happened when the Fisheries Act changed. The whole idea was that we would only be dealing with major projects. Well, I got some bad news for you. That hasn't really caught up yet. So we're still dealing with a lot of smaller stuff and mom and pop stuff. A lot of the kind of projects that people on this call deal with. And the mechanisms for dealing with the bigger stuff is in there. And that's what a lot of the 60-day and 90-day is. And people got to understand that it's taken the worst case scenario approach, and that those things don't always apply to projects of a relatively smaller nature. Think of your project, and again, I guess maybe my perspective is a little different because I'm dealing with a good chunk of the country and I'm dealing with a broad range of projects. So that's a long story. Back to the take-home message. Let us decide that it needs a Fisheries Act authorization. Let us decide that it needs a species at risk permit. Stick with the request for review when you submit your project to DFO.
All right, thank you, Rick. Our next question is directed to Axel Anderson. How does private land in the green zone and farmlands in the white zone play into the provincial watercourse crossing program? Are these inspected by regulators as well?
So I guess we're guided by the directive, and the directive focuses on public land dispositions. And I did allude to this and covered it quite quickly in, so the code of practice in the Water Act will still apply, and the appropriate inspectors will there as well. But the conditions and the potential update of the code of practice is pointing back to the directive. And so the complication there is it was initially written as a mechanism to allow crossing owners to do inspections and submit plans that understood that there was a priority, a mechanism to prioritize where they would replace expensive crossings to improve connectivity in these watersheds. And now that it's being written into other conditions where it is requiring crossing owners to do inspections in high-risk watersheds and in other places, there are questions around how enforceable it would be. So there is some work on our end to deal with some of those, I wouldn't call them loopholes, but some of those challenges that we found ourselves in, this a little bit of a circular regulatory process that we've developed, and we're working on it. And so what you're talking about falls in that bin as far as the Water Act still applies, the Public Land Act, the bed and shore stuff, all the stuff that Mike talked about applies. It's just we need to tighten that up a little bit so that it's clearer for us, for proponents, for everybody else as well. Hopefully that answers the question. That is something we're aware of and we're working on for sure.
Perfect, thank you. And we have one last question here. Are provincial biologists the fishery managers within national parks, or does that fall to Parks Canada? And this question wasn't directed at anyone, but possibly DFO.
Good question. I never thought of that. When you go into Parks Canada, you know what? I can't think of the last time I was in a federal park fishing. If you need a provincial permit, you know, a fishing license, I don't think Parks Canada issues fishing licenses. I think the only role they may play with managing the fish is that if there's a species at risk, I know we run into that trouble all the time, is we've got the species at risk program and aquatic species. Whenever we're in Parks Canada land, we are, it's with Parks Canada to manage that. We don't, because I know we've had conflicts. So, I mean, that's fisheries management. I don't know. Is there anybody on the phone who's a biologist who works for the province that might have a thought on that? Does Parks Canada manage the fish?
I can answer that, Rick. So just, Matthew, maybe just repeat that, because I think the question was not specific to fishing itself, but.
Okay. Are provincial biologists the fishery managers within national parks, or does that fall to Parks Canada?
Yeah, so no, they are not. That does fall to Parks Canada. The management of fisheries within the park itself does. And they do, Parks Canada does issue its own fishery licenses to fish within federal parks. And they're specific to each park usually. But
Perfect.
they do have their own fisheries biologists within the parks that manage the fishery in the park.
All right, thank you. It looks like that was the last of our questions. So I just want to remind everyone that these questions will be made available to all those who registered for this webinar in a few weeks' time. And the webinar will also be posted on AWC3's website. Thank you to everyone who presented today and to all those who have joined us. With continued education and information sharing, we believe we can fix this provincially significant issue. Have a great day, everyone, and again, thank you for joining, and to all the presenters.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.